The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 261 Spirit Well. In the dead of night, which was to say, during the well-lit and fairly active portion of the day that Lex usually slept, since it was never dark in this forest, Lex stood alone in front of the deadfall cliff. It had been 3 days since he visited the tunnel, and this was the first opportunity he had gotten for some privacy, mainly because everyone was focusing on the tunnel so much, Ptolemy included. Of course, because of all the hubbub created due to his discovery, Lex had learned a great deal about spirit wells, which is what caused him the most frustration. Some people at the camp had started calling him their lucky charm, but he didn't feel lucky at all. After ensuring that he really was alone, and that there were no animals or beasts around, Lex withdrew one of the many acorns in his bag and crushed it against the cliff side. A short while later, a thin and weak-looking root emerged from the cliff. "Everything all right, bro? You contacted me a lot sooner than I was expecting. Don't tell me Goli discovered you." "No, Goli did not find me. But why didn't you tell me about the spirit well? That would have helped even more than a mine." "Because I didn't know what it was, I ended up telling the camp about it, and now neither I nor you will be able to benefit from it." The root froze for a moment as it tried to process what it had heard. Spiritual energy tended to flow from one area to another and had currents much in the way there were ocean or air currents. Of course, the flow was not based on going from regions of high to low concentration, as this energy had its own sets of behaviors, but that was besides the point. Sometimes these currents faced an obstruction, and instead of flowing, spiritual energy started to gather in spots with increasing concentration. At this point, there were many ways in which spirit stones could be formed, and the way in which they would be formed would dictate their purity and concentration. What was more important to Lex, however, was the fact that, even after the spirit mine was created, the concentration of energy did not drop but continued to increase. There were chances of a well being formed. If scientists from Earth studied this phenomenon, their attention would be most attracted to the fact that, following this logic, spiritual energy being contained in a liquid state of spirit water had a higher concentration than in the solid state of a spirit stone. The truth behind such an occurrence was that spiritual energy was a lot more complicated than it seemed at a glance, and many more matters were at play here, but at Lex's level there was no need for him to know of them. All that mattered was, a single spirit well was better than several spirit mines put together. If he had known this matter beforehand, he would have directly used the method Karam gave him to dig underground and bypass the Druk. Eventually, Karam spoke hesitantly. "I was there when Goli moved in. I swept the whole area myself, there was no spirit well anywhere that I recall." "Well, how long ago was that?" Lex asked the question that really had him feeling frustrated. It occurred to him that an oversight on his part was treating a Trollope similar to humans when he clearly recalled that due to their different physiology, they treat the world differently. Trollops especially? "It was some 60,000 years ago, I think," Karam said, as it was counting the years in his mind. Lex let out a defeated sigh, as his suspicion had proven true. Trollops had a very different sense of time, since their lifespans were infinitely longer than humans. The amount of time Karam was talking about was more than enough for a spirit mine to turn into a spirit well, not to mention all the landmarks he knew to change that could be used to identify the location of the mines. There was no point in explaining to Karam how it had messed up. Lex would rather move on to the next issue. "Alright, listen up, Karam, the situation has changed. There's no way of knowing if the spirit mines you knew about still even exist, let alone being able to find them. On top of that, if they end up really discovering a spirit well, then it'll only be a matter of time before the Academy takes over. When that happens, I won't be able to get any spirit mines and you won't be able to absorb any of your cousin's forest land. So, if you want to go ahead with your plan, we need to come up with a solution and act on it within the next few days or at most a week." Karam was once again silent for a while, before he answered. "I understand, bro. I will think of something, come back in a short while." "Make sure you confirm with me before doing anything," Lex told him, not at all trusting the sensibility of the Trollope. In the end, although Karam agreed with him, Lex ultimately decided not to rely only on him. "Hey Lotus, if there was a spirit well there, why weren't you able to sense it?" Lex asked, after tapping his back. "Mr. Innkeeper, I can only detect spiritual energy if I physically feel it. With mines and wells, their energy is completely shielded and blocked from escaping, which is what causes a mine to develop in the first place. Otherwise, not only me, but everyone would easily be able to detect mines." "Figures," Lex muttered as he made his way back to the camp. His trip to the cliff had not been so simple, and he had to hide and run from some predators a few times, but even when he came back to camp with his clothes clearly having suffered damage, no one batted an eye. Instead, whoever saw Lex let out an excited cheer. He was the man of the hour, the good luck charm, and some even called him the noble prince. Lex naturally maintained the banter with everyone, but did not stay for long as he needed to get back to his tent and rest up. The backup plan he had made was fairly simple. He had already shown everyone where the tunnel was, but they had not proceeded to exploring it yet, as a Druck was not an easy foe to face, even assuming there was the only one Lex saw instead of a whole family of them. Lex had decided, despite his better judgment, to join them on their exploration of the tunnel, for even if they did discover a spirit well, no one would notice if he ended up absorbing some energy from that as well. Right? He figured, as long as the well wasn't completely drained, he would be alright. Ptolemy, on the other hand, took Lex's insistence on accompanying them as a form of mistrust, as if he would deny Lex's role in finding the well if he didn't accompany them. He felt so frustrated, in fact, that a part of him even wished that there was no well to begin with. While all of this was going on, back in his own domain, a small humanoid clump of leaves that sort of looked like Lex walked back and forth trying to figure something out. Karam had spent too long as an adolescent, and unless he could find a way of expanding his territory, he would be stuck like that. "Brew, I got it," he suddenly yelled, as an idea came to him. If the humans were too preoccupied to determine the existence of the well, that would give Lex more time to find spirit mines and lay down his seeds. Why was he stressing out over such a minor issue? All he had to do was distract the humans, maybe even trap them for a few years. That would give Lex plenty of time to search. He was so enthused by his new idea that he completely forgot about Lex's warning not to do anything without consulting him. "Dear Auntie Gina," he started to write down on a rock, preparing to send it as a letter. "You will never guess what I just saw. Goli has been meeting with humans." Karam wrote down his own version of the latest gossip of how Goli had decided to embrace the humans. The fastest way for Trollops to grow stronger was to absorb parts of other Trollops. This was why there were so few of them, not to mention the fact that so few of them ever remained close to one another. Karam did not specifically lay down any allegations, but the fact that he was so nonchalant about Goli deciding to work with humans would obviously insinuate that Karam was not the target of Goli's and the humans' cooperation. How this beloved auntie would take this news, he did not bother speculating. Soon, a massive boulder could be seen being pulled by hundreds of roots through the forest, its body entirely covered in writing. Chapter 262 Heartbeat. Instead of sleeping, Lex chose to cultivate to recover. He needed to be in top shape to protect himself while the rest of his cohorts fought the Drucks or any other enemies that might crop up. A benefit of all the exertion he was experiencing was that his cultivation was progressing quickly. While the concentration of spiritual energy mattered little for chi training, since he was absorbing individual strands of chi, the indirect benefits he was receiving of being in an energy-rich environment, such as eating healthier food or recovering from fatigue quicker, were speeding up his cultivation nonetheless. The whole process of forcing a higher number of chi into your body, and then having your body get accustomed to it, was apparently greatly facilitated by being beaten up and then recovering quickly. Considering Lex's defense, this was not how should have been cultivating, but just based on the fact that he was always surrounded by higher realm enemies made it so that the effect of his defense was always mitigated. Lex firmly entered the 6th level of chi training, and was already on his way to the peak of it. The good news was, if he continued to get hassled the way he was, it would speed up his cultivation. The bad news was, the protection talisman he had to protect him from nascent realm attacks had limited energy. While it had sustained itself so far, it was because he had not yet taken any direct hits and mostly suffered shockwave damage. Even so, eventually it would run out. While it was not a concern yet, it was something Lex had to keep in mind. Finally, it was time to explore the tunnel. The group going would be the largest group that ventured out into the forest yet, since the camp was founded. Other than Ptolemy himself, 20 of the 30 guards would be joining, as well as another 10 students that would serve auxiliary purposes to help in the combat of Drucks. Lex and Barry were the only purely non-combatants joining in, Lex because he insisted on going and Barry because, should the tunnel end prematurely, or instead form an underground maze, he would be the one to guide them and carve out a new path should it be needed. Their party set out, once again mounted on their lizards, since there was no hope of being discreet with such a large group. Many animals would run away as soon as they saw the size of their party, but some of the stronger beasts still fought with them. However, no matter how much they fought or how much noise they made, the forest no longer made any moves on them. Lex genuinely wondered what Ptolemy had done to achieve such a result. A few hours later, they finally reached the mouth of the tunnel. At the sight of the descending path, a new mood overtook the group. It was not anxiety or fear, this time, but that of excitement. One of the group members ventured ahead while the rest stayed back and secured the area. A small concealing formation was set up so that no other beast would accidentally discover it and attack them from behind. A short while later, the group member that ventured into the tunnel came back out, a grim look on his face. According to the probe, there's 3 drucks down there. The group members had various reactions, with most grimacing as well, but a few jumped up with ecstatic faces. What happened? Lex asked his fellow non-combatant, Barry. 3 drucks means the size of the spirit well is large enough to support 3 of them. But, at the same time, each druck is ridiculously difficult to defeat. They eat various metals and absorb them into their body, augmenting their defense. Adolescent drucks, like the one you saw, get their tough body as a result of the metals, but adult drucks form a unique alloy that is even more difficult to penetrate. 3 drucks signifies that 2 are probably parents while 1 is probably a child. Facing 2 adult drucks, it's not an exciting concept. But, at the same time, the reward will be all the greater. Lex silently watched as Ptolemy discussed the plan with the rest of the combatants. He silently wondered, should he use the distraction from the fight to reach the well? If someone found out, it would be highly suspicious. Once they were done with their plans, the group continued into the tunnel. Their primary plan was to try to capture the younger druck, if possible, to use against the older ones. However, if capture seemed impossible, they would find ways to fight the beasts one at a time. They held no illusion that fighting all 3 together would be their demise. It did not take long, barely a few minutes, before they once again ran into the druck that Lex had encountered, still asleep. The built-up anticipation mixed with anxiety as the group quietly assumed their positions. Barry and Lex were farthest back, while a few went ahead to ensure the 2 adults weren't nearby. The longer they took, the greater the tension that built up. Lex suddenly became very aware of his heartbeat. It was not beating fast, and maintained an even pace, but suddenly he felt like each beat was like a hammer trying to break through his chest. Ba-dump. One of the guards, a female, moved close to the druck, holding a rope made of bark. Ba-dump. 3 others surrounded the group, trying to set up a suppression array. Ba-dump. Everyone drew their weapons, the sheen of their blades cutting through the darkness of the tunnel. Ba-dump. A drop of sweat rolled down Ptolemy's brow. Ba-dump. A nod, so subtle one could have missed it if they weren't watching for it, from one of the group members was all the confirmation they needed. The adults were far away. Ba-dump. Just as they had been ambushed so suddenly a short while ago, the group ambushed the druck this time. Any kind of metal was useless against drucks, so the weapons they used were made of special synthesized materials and should have been harder and sharper than steel. Despite the surprise, though, their attacks failed to pierce the beast all the way through. The druck did not roar angrily when it opened its eyes. No, the tunnel itself released a sharp wail at their blasphemy. The walls shivered under the weight of the beast picking itself up, and then shivered again as all the metal ores were pulled straight out of them and fell to the ground like melting ice. The sight of a massive, angry beast glaring them down with murder in its eyes would have intimidated a lesser group, but not this one. So far, things were going according to plan. As soon as the beast stood up, various members of the group swung their ropes through the beast's legs. Their intention wasn't to tie it up, but rather, flip it. With inhuman strength, members of the group used the ropes to pull the beast in the air, while others attacked it once again, flipping it over. Its 2 front claws, its primary weapons, were pushed deep into the tunnel walls so that the druck wouldn't be able to pull it out easily. Upside down, and immobile, the beast was unable to retaliate as the group started to suppress it with their arrays. The beast was definitely a young one, and was too used to its foes being intimidated by its display of power. What it didn't know was that to these academy students, threats meant nothing except time gained to counterattack. So far, things were going according to plan. But when the druck finally awoke from the shock of what was happening to it, it finally roared in anger. Stalactites shattered from the power of its voice alone, and Lex was pushed back, having to take Barry's support, but not much else happened. Its claws were already stuck in the wall, and it had been manipulated in such a way that it wasn't able to exert its full strength to pull them out. An unusual stalemate was formed where the druck wasn't able to attack, but none of the humans' attacks hurt the druck. But the stalemate wouldn't last long. If the humans weren't able to do something, the other 2 would eventually notice something wrong. Time was against them. Try taming or subduing techniques, Lex suddenly suggested. Its physical defense was astounding, but that did not necessarily mean the same for its mind. Ptolemy gave Lex a dirty look before turning to someone else and giving them the nod. They were already going to do that, but with Lex's suggestion, it now seemed like it was his idea. Overall, it didn't matter, but Ptolemy was irked by the fact that Lex seemed to be getting the credit. Suddenly, Lex's heart started beating faster. Something was wrong. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 263 Auntie Gina. This time, Lex did not bother warning Ptolemy and the rest, for he had understood that their resilience was beyond what he imagined. He grabbed Barry, used Falcon's relief, and sped back as fast as he could. As they moved back, and their view of the tunnel increased, their pupils constricted. The fight, so far, had been in a realm that Lex could understand. The students were hitting the Druk with all their strength to hurt it, while the Druk's abnormal defense kept it safe. Any tactics or strategies employed still made sense to him, and the way they manipulated the inexperienced Druk to flip him over, and put him in his most vulnerable position also made sense. But there was a fundamental fact that Lex overlooked, simply because he was used to being around extremely powerful cultivators. Up until the Golden Core realm, cultivators gained access to greater and more powerful techniques that allowed them to do increasingly incredible things. However, in the nascent realm, things became more complex. Yes, nascent-level cultivators could, of course, use more powerful and destructive techniques than Golden Core ones. But, in that realm, their strength transcended realms such as simple physical damage. Even something as simple as a flame produced by them would carry a sense of profoundness anyone other than the desensitized Lex would sense. But, irrespective of how desensitized he was, currently he could feel it. The various metals that had been pulled out of the tunnel walls, which everyone had been ignoring up until now, surged as if they had come to life and formed a tsunami of liquid metal. But more than the physical intimidation of a giant wave of molten metal, hurling towards you, the wave had a sense of oppression that pressed on Lex's very existence. Even as Lex retreated and tried to get away, he was reminded of the coercion he faced against the Craven on his first day in this realm. There was nothing about this oppression that Lex could defend against, as it touched on matters beyond his understanding. A part of him also suddenly understood why the inn was so spectacular. When the difference between two beings was too vast, even without them doing anything, the lesser being would naturally be oppressed. The inn prevented that and created a safe environment where everyone could interact safely as equals. But this understanding was fleeting. Currently, Lex was running for his life. He did not turn to see how Ptolemy and the rest would react to the attack. He was sure they had contingencies. He was only concerned about saving his skin. If they hadn't left their lizard mounts outside the tunnel, he might have escaped quicker, but the entrance of the tunnel was too small and narrow, and so now he had to rely on his 2 feet. "Let me," said Barry, as soon as he realized what was happening. Instead of being pulled along by Lex, he grabbed the ladder and ran at a speed dozens of times faster than Lex. In a few seconds, they had completely escaped the battleground. "That was really something," Lex said, as he tried to catch his breath. "Yeah, it really was. I had heard rumors about your incredible foreshadowing ability, but seeing it in action as something else entirely." "My what?" asked the distracted Lex. "Your foreshadowing ability. Your ability to sense danger. I heard that when we were ambushed on the first day, you detected the attack beforehand and managed to warn Ptolemy. This time again, you detected the Druk's attack before anyone else." "Oh, that? It's just a gut feeling, no ability or anything," Lex said dismissively. Barry did not comment further, but all it took was a single look to detect that he had other thoughts on the matter. "What now?" Lex finally asked once he had gotten over the shock of the coercion. Mentally, he was planning out how he should get Barry to help him find the spirit well. However, it seemed like he didn't need to do anything. "They'll take care of the Druk, don't doubt them, but it might take some time. My objective, however, has always been to find the spirit well. Since we've already gone deeper into the tunnels, I suggest we don't waste our time and continue searching. I'll leave covert tracks so that the main group will be able to follow us once they're done." "I agree," Lex said promptly. Barry opened up his own backpack and took out a pair of black gloves and a few items to help him find the way, while Lex took out his fancy monocle and put it on. Barry put his right arm against the tunnel wall and started to slowly move forward. The descending slope in the tunnel slowly started to get steeper until it was almost at a 45-degree angle. While not ideal, it was not able to stop their progress forward, yet soon they encountered a problem. It was not the usual, left or right diverging paths in the tunnel, but a direct vertical drop on one side and another descending slope on the other. Personally, Lex felt they should go directly down, as based on his understanding, the well should be somewhere deep underground. But, in this instance, Lex didn't need to guess, as he had the luxury of being guided by an expert. In this case, it turned out Lee's instinct was correct, and Barry grabbed hold of Lex before slowly descending the vertical drop. "How do you tell what way to go?" Lex asked after they finally reached the bottom, only to be welcomed by a few diverging paths. "Spirit stone mines," Barry began to answer, absent-mindedly, as his focus was still on determining their path, "are formed due to a few recurring reasons. 2 of the most common reasons for such mines to form are due to 2 different kinds of ores, orichalcum and deitite ores. Both are naturally formed ores, but they both behave exactly opposite to one another. Orichalcum, in its natural state, greedily absorbs spirit energy. When enough of it is found together, and absorbs enough energy, the ore automatically turns into spirit stones. Lex was suddenly reminded of the red gold dust, a specific kind of metal found on Mars used by the Morrison family that was great at absorbing spiritual energy. He wondered if it was the same thing. Deitite, on the other hand, is an excellent insulator for spiritual energy, and blocks, or in some cases, even traps spiritual energy when it encounters it. Eventually, if enough energy is absorbed, spirit stones naturally begin to form automatically. There are a few more ways in which mines are formed, but they are relatively rare. Anyway, this is not an exact science, as more often than not, these ores can be found without the presence of any mines, but if you ever suspect the presence of a mine, just go to the area with the highest concentration of these ores. If such a mine exists, it's bound to be located there. Of course, detecting specific ores through several layers of dirt and rocks and other materials is not so simply achieved. Even I need special tools. Lex asked no more, but he tried to use the monocle to pick up traces of these ores Barry mentioned. He did not see the names, but the monocle detected many ores qualified as unknown, one of which Lex suspected was either one of the ores Barry was talking about. This was good, he had discovered another way to search for mines. Gully Forest, inside a wooden hut in the middle of the forest. A massive snake with a body made entirely of hundreds of tree branches was slithering around in circles. Gully was furious, but there was not much it could do for now. The cursed human had some kind of evil flame that could not only feed on Gully's own flames but could even attack any of Gully's spirit attached to any plant Gully controlled. Until he found a solution to that flame, attacking the humans would only end up hurting it instead. There was a knock on the door of the hut, breaking Gully from his reverie. But, more than curious, Gully felt afraid. What kind of entity could reach his hut without him even realizing? He could even think of one. Before his thoughts could continue, the door to the hut fell onto the ground, and in walked the most lascivious rosebush Gully had ever seen. "Auntie Gina," he croaked, chills running down his wooden spine. "What brings you to my humble home?" He could not stop his voice from quivering or his body from trembling. The smell of roses filled his hut, and Gully, despite his subdued plant nature, started to feel urges that were more human than plant. "Little Gully, you've grown so big," the bush whispered as it ran a thorny stem across the wooden snake. "And I heard little Gully wants to grow up. Do you want your good old auntie to help you become an adult?" Chapter 264 Buried. Gully trembled so hard his snake form almost unraveled. It may seem like Auntie Gina was only teasing, but amongst trollops, using another trollop to reach adulthood was a very serious issue. One way for them to reach adulthood, naturally, was to slowly age and eventually grow into it. But this was one of the rare cases where a long lifespan worked against them. Growing into adulthood would take so long that your chances of being killed were incredibly high in the meantime. The second method was to take over some natural landscape and grow it, but realistically speaking, it was difficult to find an unoccupied area large enough to achieve this. The third and fastest way was to forcefully encroach upon a landscape that was once occupied by a trollop. To be clear, this was not lethal to the other trollop, but it would naturally weaken them a lot. In this case, if Gully admitted to wanting to use her help to reach adulthood, it would mean encroaching on her land. Gina was so incredibly strong that even the thought of it was borderline insane. To explain the power difference, Gully, who used his forest to strongly suppress the human expedition, and had for so long resulted in a halt of human expansion of territory, was himself only in the golden core realm. Despite his own individual low cultivation, the might he could wield was much larger, due to having the entire forest and its energy at his beck and call. Karam too was in the golden core realm, albeit he was weaker than Gully. So then it could be imagined how powerful Gina was, as an earth immortal trollop. "No auntie, not at all," the wooden snake barely managed to say. "Oh? But then, why am I hearing something else? That you are partnering up with some humans to upgrade your fire and take my land?" "No. No auntie, it's..." "Stop stuttering. Just answer this, are there humans in the forest, yes or no?" "Yes," Gully replied meekly. "And do they not have a flame stronger than your own?" "Yes," he replied, suddenly feeling like something bad was about to happen. No matter how he tried to explain, it would definitely seem like he wanted the humans' help to upgrade his beautiful, golden flames to that nasty, stinky green flame. Gina only chuckled as she saw the young trollop shy away. "Dear young Gully, you may not want my help. But, I have some thoughts of my own. I think it's about time you boys grew up, or at least one of you did. Your younger cousin Karam told me that you had partnered up with the humans to take over my land. The fact that he wanted to pit me against you makes me think that he's the one who has partnered with the humans. But I don't care about any of that. I see you boys, too content with life, and it makes me sad. So I think it was time you boys matured a little. One of you needs to grow up. I don't care who and I don't care how. But if I see you two slacking again, then I might be the one to take over both of your lands. It would be a waste to leave it to either of you. What about the humans?" Goli suddenly asked, as he watched his aunt turn around and leave. What about them? I don't care about humans, I just want results. Instead of a groan, Lex just let out an exasperated sigh as he covered the bleeding wound on his chest. It did not matter for squat how good his defenses were if his enemies were just too strong. On the bright side, he had gotten better at responding to his instincts of danger, and dodged almost all attacks. He watched impassively as Barry crushed some kind of rock monster. Even though he was not a fighter, all humans here had at least some combat background. That, accompanied by his peak golden core cultivation, made it so that he could at least defend the two of them. Lex and Barry had been ambushed by some kind of a rock monster that had escaped the detection of Barry as well as the fancy monocle. Even now, as Barry broke its body to pieces, his monocle only identified it as sedimentary rock and not a living thing. After a few moments, when Lex removed his hand, his bleeding had stopped. This was not because he had recovered, but instead because he had gotten injured so many times in the last few hours. He suddenly learned he could control his body the way body cultivators could. While it would not mitigate the damage done, he could stretch his skin to cover sharp cuts and move his muscles around to accommodate his injuries. For the glass-half-full kind of people, it would seem that Lex had gained something from being mercilessly attacked numerous times. For Lex, it just seemed like they still hadn't made it to the mine. How much farther? Lex asked as he surveyed the surrounding area. Suddenly, more rock monsters would be fine for Barry, but they could spell real trouble for him. I cannot detect the ores that deep. I can only progressively move to an area of higher concentration of the relevant ore. Then we should keep moving. At some point, Lex considered ditching Barry and directly using the method Karam had given him to directly go underground till he reached the mine. But these tunnels were infested with various goo, not to mention rock monsters and the like, so he would never make it far on his own. So he continued to stick by Barry and made slow progress. Yeah. They had been slowly moving deeper underground for hours now, and the farther down they got, the hotter the tunnels started to become. They also started getting wider and larger, and Lex had come across many more rocks containing gold. A part of him was sad that he couldn't carry all that gold with him, even though he didn't really have a need for gold. 20 minutes later, they reached a dead end. This wasn't the first dead end they had been faced with, but this one was different because... I think we've reached the mine, Barry said with excitement. Then why are we stopping? Because it's most likely that the other two drugs we detected are in the mine. Are you sure you want to go ahead without waiting for the rest to catch up? Lex could not reply as his mouth was left open. He remembered how strong the juvenile Druck had been. He didn't want to face two adults alone. Instead, he limited himself to looking at the wall fondly. In truth, he was trying to see if the system could detect the energy yet. But the world, or rather the crystal realm, never truly cared for the plans of others. While Barry was content with waiting for the rest, the situation would not allow it. The ground began to tremble, and the walls of the tunnel started to groan. There was an earthquake, and the tunnel didn't really seem to be handling it well. For once, even Lex was caught off guard, and had no idea how to respond. But as the tunnel started to collapse, and they suffered a cave-in, he quickly moved next to Barry, which ended up being the right move. Barry's training and forethought suddenly failed him as his first true life and death situation filled his mind with panic. He used his digging technique to push through the wall towards the mine, trying to escape the collapsing tunnel. No matter how strong he was, he couldn't tolerate hundreds of tons of earth crashing down onto him. Despite his panic, his speed was incredible, and he tore through the supposed dead end until he reached another open cave. Barry and Lex were both hit by a sudden gust of wind, and Lex grinned as the system finally let him know it could detect a massive store of energy. Just as he told the system to absorb some of the energy, the situation went from bad to horrifically apocalyptic. The earthquake hadn't stopped, and while they had entered the outermost layer of the spirit mine, or well, instead of tunnel walls filled with shining spirit stones, or caverns full of spirit water, they were welcomed by erupting lava. Barry let out a scream filled with fear and horror as the lava enveloped them, and before they could even think of retreat, the cave-in caught up with them, pushing the duo firmly into the lake of lava. Up above, the Trolop Goli was shifting the roots of all the trees in the forest, pushing and pulling the ground with an endless fury as he prepared for a decisive battle with its cousin. Hundreds of trees that were thousands of years old pulled out their roots from the confines of the ground, causing countless artificial quakes and drastically changed the landscape. Goli channeled all the energy of the forest, whether it was held underground in his mines, or in his trees or treasures, all into his emerging army. He was as furious at Karam as he was afraid of Gina. Someone would definitely pay for disturbing his peaceful life. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 265 Annihilation. In movies, being burnt by lava was a slow and agonizing process where the person exposed to the lava was slowly absorbed into it as if he were being pulled into quicksand. The truth of it was quite different. Lava was thick and heavy, and being pressed against literally thousands of tons of it felt just about as solid as being pressed against a wall. Of course, this wall was on fire, and the air was on fire and the ground was on fire and basically everything other than Lex himself was on fire. His protective talisman had turned on, and sandwiched between the lava and debris, Lex remained unhurt, even if only for now. Acting on instinct alone, Lex quickly pulled up his backpack and quickly opened it to find the acorns given to him by Karam. While at a glance, all the acorns looked the same, they all actually served many purposes. The only one he had used so far was to hide his special scent from Goli, but there were others in here, as well. Some of them were meant to be crushed by Lex once he was inside a spirit mine, while others would drill down and bring him deep underground. As soon as he found the acorn, he reached out to grab Barry so that the two of them could escape together. That was when, under the combined weight of the debris and the burning fury of the lava, his talisman extinguished. What Lex felt next was too extreme to be quantified and too varied to be called pain. The pressure on his body was so sudden and so immense that he physically felt himself being squeezed to death. Yet, his mind did not have the time or the capacity to think thoughts such as, "I'm dead," or even, "this hurts." It was not a slow process. In the millionth of a second that it took for his body to start being squeezed to death, the lava not only burnt his clothes, his skin, his hair, his muscles, but the small metallic chunks in the lava that had not fully melted started to attach to his body, as if welded together. There was no plan, no thoughts, no escape, only an orchestra of extremes that bombarded Lex. It was indistinguishable through the glow of the lava, but a piece of his exposed skull shone for a brief moment, and a single word that had been carved into his skull long ago disappeared. Furthermore, had his mind been coherent, he would have realized that his back started to feel cool, and even the temperature of the lava dropped drastically. But none of that mattered, for the single moment in which Lex felt annihilation close in on his body and mind, the acorns in his hand were also crushed. A thin, wooden layer covered Lex's skin, and an extension Barry, who Lex was holding onto, formed a wooden shell before it started to pull them underground. The heat of the lava and the pressure of the ground seemed to do nothing to the frail-looking layer of wood, and if anything, seemed to strengthen it further. After all, which root was afraid of digging through the dirt, and which root did not strip the ground of its resources to act as fertilizer for itself? In front of the power of a trolop, the lava was nothing more than a consolidated pool of fertilizer. The duo kept moving deeper into the lava, but Lex had already fainted, so he had no idea. Instead, it was the severely burnt and wounded Barry who gained the awareness that he was no longer in pain. Confused and disoriented, he could not tell what had happened, but he could tell that something seemed to be moving. Safe now, or at least saved from all that pain, Barry let his mind wander as he allowed his body to slowly heal. Sometime later, they had moved right through the lava, and the wooden shell was now digging through rock and dirt, continuously bringing them deeper underground. Eventually, instead of ground, they dug into a cavern and the duo went into a freefall until they were dropped into a clear, cool pool. As if sensing its task complete, the wooden shell broke open, letting the cool liquid rush in and wash the burnt duo. This was, of course, spirit water. While it did not have magical, mystical properties that could miraculously heal them, the spirit water nourished their bodies and provided them with the energy to heal. Barry, who was already somewhat conscious, was quickly roused by the cooling, refreshing feeling bathing his body. For a moment, he lost himself in the endless soothing feeling, until he remembered what had happened to him and jolted up. The darkness of the cavern was not a problem for him, for he had excellent vision even in the dark and fortunately, his eyes had not been damaged. It took but a moment for him to realize they had discovered the spirit well and ecstasy flooded his battered mind before it converted to panic just as quickly. Spirit water was extremely nourishing to him for he was in the golden core realm, but for Lex, who was still in chi training, it was not but poison. Chi training cultivators absolutely could not allow a high concentration of spirit energy to enter their body, as they were still only dealing with individual strands of energy, chi. He grabbed Lex's unconscious body and quickly jumped out of the pool before carefully examining him, ready to expect the worst. Somehow, though, Lex seemed to be alright. Well, about as alright as one could be after having their entire body burnt and buried. He was exhibiting signs of energy poisoning, and though his body was covered in severe burns from top to bottom, he was breathing normally and did not seem to be dying. Not completely relieved, Barry decided to check Lex's condition thoroughly to ensure the boy was alright. Although he was not sure how they escaped, he knew for a fact that it wasn't due to anything he did, nor did he believe in some god blessing them and allowing them to miraculously survive. That obviously only left Lex. He must have done something or used some treasure that allowed them to survive. Unfortunately, while Lex did not seem to be dying, his condition otherwise could not be called good by any measure. He had severe burns on every part of his body, except a small patch on his back that somehow survived, and some parts of his body had even burned directly to the bone. To be frank, Barry had no idea how Lex was even alive in this condition. While he himself was in a similar state, at least he had his cultivation to support him. What did Lex have? But while this may have been a good question in another situation, after making sure Lex was alright, Barry turned his attention to the cavern. They had finally reached the spirit well, but he had not yet seen the remaining 2 druks. Where were they? Chapter 266 Reforging Lex. Slowly and carefully, the naked Barry searched the cavern. All signs pointed towards the fact that the 2 druks had been here only a short while ago, but had just left. Maybe they had finally been attracted to Ptolemy and the rest. What he didn't know was that Goli had summoned all the strongest beasts living in his territory for the upcoming war. They had managed to avoid the druks by only a few minutes. Whatever the case, they seemed to be safe for now, but just barely. Barry had none of his treasures with him, they had been lost, except for one of the gloves he previously wore and had melted right into his hand. They didn't have any medicine either. All Barry could do was submerge himself in the spirit water to help accelerate his healing, and when he felt strong enough, he would start to look for a way out. Contrary to what one might expect, Barry was not actually being greedy for the spirit water and was just doing whatever he thought the best thing was to escape because he was in an insane amount of pain. The fact that he wasn't yelling and groaning around despite the condition of his body, wincing at the slightest movement, was a testament to his determination, as well as how afraid he was for his life. His only thought right now was how to get back to the camp. But, without any medicine, and without a mystical end that would heal all their wounds to retreat to, recovery was slow. Soon, the cavern became so quiet that the sound of Lex's breathing could be heard like a concert. As for Lex, his situation was complicated. Being squeezed like a lemon while also being burnt like barbecue prepared by an amateur cook, all the while having his mind bombarded with the most intense stimuli he had ever experienced, was not really enough to kill him. Maybe if he had stayed in that situation a while longer, he would have died, but currently he was only wounded. Due to the special condition of his body, it was not so easy to kill him or hamper his recovery. For all intents and purposes, a majority of his wounds were only cosmetic. Furthermore, since the experience he had undergone was extremely intense, as a function of regal embrace, his thoughts and feelings about the experience had been packed away in a corner of his brain until he was strong enough to handle them. This didn't mean his memory was erased. It just meant that when he thought back to the experience of being cooked alive, he would only feel emotionless. So, Lex was alive and not in mortal danger. Then what was his current situation? He was extremely, severely physically exhausted, and so had fallen asleep. It would take him exceptionally long to heal, or it should have if his body was only operating under the influence of the regal embrace. But, while it only appeared like a tattoo on his back, in truth, his body was housing a world seed lotus. The most basic function of this lotus was to create a 5-star world, but was that it? Was such a function enough for the seed to this flower to be considered rare in the entire universe? That would be like saying 5-star worlds were rare in the universe, which was not the case. But while the other functions of the lotus remained a mystery, just its ability to create a world, any world let alone a 5-star one, was more than enough to give the lotus the energy to help heal a simple chi-training human body. But it could not create something out of nothing. So it began to absorb the bits of metal from the lava that had welded onto Lex's body, into Lex's body. It absorbed the melted remains of the fancy monocle that had covered Lex's left eye, into his left eye. It absorbed the spirit water into Lex's body to replace some of his blood that had boiled away. It absorbed the ash from the numerous acorns Karam had given Lex into his body. It absorbed the clump of metal that had once been the heavy Harley. And, when it discovered that all of this was not enough, slowly and steadily it began absorbing the unusual alloy that filled the walls of the cavern around Lex. To the lotus, these were just ingredients, and all it had to do was use them in the best possible way to create whatever it wanted. As a creator of worlds, this was as natural to it as breathing was to humans, so it did not even need to use all its attention for this matter. 99% of the lotus was still asleep and only 1% of the infant lotus worked on Lex, which is why it was taking so long to begin with. Otherwise, had it fully woken up, it would have taken mere moments. But this ended up working in Lex's favor, as such an abrupt recovery would have alarmed Barry. So, for the next 6 hours, the duo remained where they were, silently recovering. After 6 hours, Barry still had not recovered enough to come even close to his full strength, but he was too nervous to stay in the druk lair any longer. He picked up Lex's body and, for a moment, wondered why Lex's body felt heavier than he remembered. But he attributed the change to his own exhaustion. To be honest, he was still amazed that Lex was even alive. He used a technique to engrave some markers into the walls here, so that he would be able to find this place again, and quickly made his way out one of the many exits. He no longer had his treasures to detect or density and the like, so he could only go down a path blindly, hoping for the best. Midnight Inn, in front of the lazy river. Raphael Carter Bravi, son of King Hanson Marlowe Bravi IV, slowly stood up from his wheelchair and grinned. As he took his first, unsteady step towards the lazy river, he felt a sleeping tiger within him waking up. He had not come back from the future to laze around. He had come to dominate. Much like the first literal step he had just taken, it was time to take his first step towards his new, glorious future. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 267 Body Survival. They had suffered a cave-in, were lurking in the lair of two incredibly strong beasts and had their entire bodies cindered, which is exactly why Barry was not at all concerned that he was buck naked, carrying another unconscious naked man through the darkness. But while he slowly explored the tunnel, looking for a way out, he did not know that they were probably the most relaxed in the entire forest right now. However, such good luck would not last much longer. With the two druks gone, for a while the underground tunnels were filled with peace. But, as perceptive as they were, the numerous creatures that the druks had suppressed, and were subsequently kept away from the spirit well, began to detect their absence. With such a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity before them, how could they remain calm for long? At first, Barry was only assaulted by some of the unusual rock monsters that could even escape his detection. Fortunately, while their camouflage was immaculate, their strength was well within Barry's capacity to face. It was when Barry started to see strange insects that the situation took a turn for the worse. A millipede with a massive body and each leg the size of Barry himself suddenly dug out of the roof in front of Barry and paused for a moment as it scanned the two humans. It considered whether to stop its journey for a snack, but then continued to dig downwards, its tunnel collapsing behind it. Ants that came all the way up to Barry's waist started to appear in the tunnels, scurrying around as if searching for something. They were still ignoring them, but Barry began getting more and more nervous. It was only a matter of time before some decided to attack him, and while he could hold his own for now, he would easily get outnumbered. It was while Barry was having this crisis that Lex, who had been asleep so far, suddenly opened his eyes. His instincts were screaming death and time was too short to communicate. Flipping over, he fell out of Barry's grasp and onto the floor, immediately employed Falcon's relief and bolted while dragging Barry behind him. An evil, gut-wrenching screech reverberated through the tunnels, as if mad that its ambush had been detected, before a bony, metallic creature fell from the ceiling right above where the two humans had been. Bloody hell! Barry exclaimed as the hairs on his back lifted and he felt the malevolent hunger the creature looked at them with. "Guide me," he said, as he took over running once again, and lifted Lex on his back. Initially, a deep part of him was feeling like some kind of savior for bringing the wounded Lex with him, but now he knew well enough that without Lex's keen sense for danger, he may not even get out. Due to the urgency of the situation, Lex did not notice that despite his current situation, he was not in any pain. This was not a result of any mystical magic, in fact, all his nerves had burnt and so he could not feel anything. It was only when he tried to speak, but no sound came out, that he somewhat realized that his body's condition was not the best. Still, now was not the time to waste on stuff like that. He patted Barry's left shoulder to let him know to turn left, and thereafter started communicating through taps. While his physical condition was far from ideal, his instincts for danger were as keen as ever. This was not to say that Barry was unable to detect enemies with his own spirit senses, but just that in this situation Lex served as a better compass. He was not guiding Barry towards the outside, he had no way of knowing that, he was simply guiding him on the path that felt the least dangerous. But as the current situation was far from ideal, they still ended up encountering some enemies on their path. This was when Barry showed his real ruthlessness. He had no time for a careful, drawn-out fight. He used the most direct and overpowering methods to bulldoze his way through any obstacle. There was another earthquake, and despite himself, Barry paused to look at the ceiling. Even the many monsters and insects that were fighting paused, though for entirely different reasons. Up above, on the ground, the war had begun. Since he made the first move, Goalie caught Karam unprepared and managed to deal a considerable amount of damage. But Karam had a strategically superior position that made it easier for him to retaliate. While the bro was not able to drive out Goalie's invading forces, he could easily counterattack while he defended. The matter was as simple as hurling a massive boulder off the cliff. Just the force generated from gravity was enough to deal considerable damage. The quake that they felt was the result of one such attack. The insects and monsters, however, were not responding to a call for arms by Goalie. Instead, they, or at least the leaders for their respective colonies, were realizing that the situation might be more beneficial than they thought. Unlike the beasts, the insects, or goo, did not have a cooperative relationship with the trollops. A situation in which the trollop was distracted was the perfect opportunity for them to plunder. Lex suddenly squeezed Barry's shoulders hard, a sign that they were in intense danger. And indeed, the moment Barry began running once again, a cacophony of celebratory shrieks filled the tunnels and chaos erupted. The insects were not even chasing after the humans anymore. They were outright destroying the tunnel walls and eating any ores or roots that they discovered. Of course, if Barry and Lex came their way, they were more than delighted to add them to the menu. Tunnels started collapsing left and right, and more quakes seemed to follow. Suddenly, when Lex went from squeezing Barry's shoulder to digging his nails into him, he knew the situation called for drastic measures. "Hold on," Barry yelled, and activated a technique he was trying to avoid using. A violent surge of spirit energy erupted from Barry and coated the two in a bronze light. Like a bullet, Barry shot directly upwards even as the ground collapsed under him, and instead of crashing into the ceiling, he fell into the rock as if he were diving into a pool. They were moving at incredible speeds, but the already wounded and exhausted Barry could maintain the technique for only a few seconds, bringing them much higher and closer to the surface. Once the technique ended, Barry's legs crumpled as his exhaustion caught up to him. But instead of falling on the ground, Lex swapped positions and put the man on his back. Not wasting any time, Lex began running. His skin and nerves were burnt so he could not feel the warm breeze, and his nose was broken so he could not smell the scent of burning wood, but his vision had improved, though he hadn't realized that yet, and even in the darkness he could see the grooves of the rocks in the tunnel walls. For some reason, looking at them and observing the shape and direction they were bent in, he could determine the direction the tunnel met the surface. He did not know the nuances behind why he knew this, but he was not in the mood to question anything right now. He attributed it to his instincts and ran for his life. But, just because he was the one running now instead of Barry did not mean the insects disappeared, or ignored him. That would have been too coincidental and fortunate. No, the chaos was only increasing and the attacks Lex faced were even more numerous than Barry had. But, instead of facing them head-on, he did something that would surprise even him when he thought back to this moment later on. He started dodging his enemies with the precision and accuracy of an American football player dodging tackles. He swerved just enough to dodge a scythe-like claw, jumped just high enough to avoid a biting ant and evaded just enough to feel the wind of an attacking monster, but avoid its body. For a moment, Lex even felt like he heard thunderous clapping of a crowd. Then his mind connected the sound not to a stadium crowd, but the thumping sound of a marching army. Lex saw a part of the tunnel collapse, and light shone in like the rays of salvation that would rescue them from their plight. With skill Lex had no right to possess, he dodged every attack. Well, not really, he just couldn't feel pain so he had no idea that he had actually been struck a few times, and finally exited the accursed tunnel. But what lay awaiting him was not salvation. It was a horde of massive ape-like beasts, equipped with wooden spears that might as well have been small trees. Then, as if he had not just walked into an enemy force that could eliminate him, Lex looked at the nearest beast and somehow, in a croaking voice said, "Quickly inform Lord Goalie. Karam has invaded the tunnel from the underground and is taking the spirit water. Send your armies underground, we cannot let the enemy succeed." Chapter 268 Luck. In English, the term beast carried with it a negative or derogatory connotation. It was often used to describe another as lower or less intellectual than oneself. But in the context of actual beasts, as in a group of living beings, that was far from the truth. First of all, it was important to understand what a beast was in the context of the cultivation world. A common misconception, at least amongst humans, was that beasts were animals that began cultivating. They could not be judged for having this view, for this often was the case for many species of beasts who had an animalistic nature and lacked intelligence whilst in the mortal realm. But strictly speaking, that was not what defined a creature as a beast. In the cultivation world, a beast was a creature whose cultivation depended upon heritage and would, while growing in cultivation, slowly undergo evolution until it achieved the species that stood at the apex of its heritage. This was exactly why so many beasts paid so much attention to rare or powerful bloodlines, as they provided a much higher end point than weaker ones. This is also what contributed to Fenrir's high evaluation, not only its heritage, but the purity of that heritage. This should not be confused with other species that rely on bloodline abilities. For example, even though there were many subspecies of humans, and many humans that carried foreign bloodline, as a human grew in cultivation, his or her species would ultimately change from what it was. Yes, the bloodline ability may become more pronounced, but at the end of the day, it would only be limited to the ability. Of course, Marlowe who was undergoing the path of a prime was different, as his cultivation also depended on evolution, but any kids he had would not be primes but regular humans. Thus, regardless of whatever height he achieved, he could not leave behind a heritage, only a strong bloodline. What was the point in bringing all this up right now? It was the simple fact that, should anyone be naive enough to imagine it would be easy to fool a beast, they would be gravely mistaken. The massive apes that surrounded Lex and Barry were not one of the main 7 races only because they lacked the population for such a claim. As limited as they were, each one of them boasted ridiculous physical strength and an inherent affinity for wielding the spear. If anyone ever thought that an affinity for a weapon would make them weaker than someone with an affinity for an element, such as fire or lightning, for example, was more than welcome to try. But besides their combat prowess, they had a very intricate tribal system that gave equal value to intelligence and strength. So when they were marching together, off to war, there most certainly was some sort of leader within their ranks who had the ability to distinguish a fallacy. This leader would also know that, while the current war did not seem to target humans, Goli was infamously racist towards humans and would never work with them. So, regardless of what kind of important or vital information a human brought, they would never escape suspicion. Which is why it was incredibly fortunate that neither Lex nor Barry seemed like they had anything to do with humans. Lex may have been bipedal, but then so were the apes, so that was not enough to arouse doubt. Instead of the soft and fragile skin that humans were most commonly identified by, these 2 creatures were covered in char and soot. They wore dirt and small rocks on their bodies the way humans wore clothes, and the muscles on their limbs were tough and wore signs of being tempered in fire. Furthermore, they did not smell of humans either, but of fire and smoke. The ape identified them as some variant of moles with a strong fire affinity, perfect subordinates for the druks that would temper their bodies in molten metal. "I will pass on your message," the leader of this troop said, giving an acknowledging nod to these 2 valiant beasts. They had suffered great harm to bring them this important news, when they could have easily hidden instead. Taking that as his sign to leave, Lex identified the direction the apes were heading in, and decided to run in the opposite direction, completely unhindered by the beasts who saw them interact with the apes. His face only showed his determined expression, but internally Lex was flooded with relief. He had taken a big gamble back there, because honestly, he saw no way of surviving should they get into a fight. His mind worked at incredible speeds to determine the best way he could resolve the situation. Since they had already suffered many attacks from various beasts, and he could determine that the beasts had attacked under the instruction of Goli, he estimated that Goli was the leader of all the beasts. That guess was not accurate, but functionally, such a guess worked well enough. Second, because of his contact with Karam, he knew the 2 Trollops were not on the best of terms and even harbored subtle hostilities towards one another. Third, he knew that the spirit well would be an important asset regardless of the situation. Keeping in mind these points, he instantly fabricated a story that put him in the right. It was not some intricate plan he concocted, but something he did so instinctively he was speaking before he even realized. A number of other factors played into his ruse working, including the ongoing war and his current appearance, but Lex would never know how lucky he had just been. However, even though he was lucky, it was because of his believable story that they got away, so he still deserved some credit. Lex did not know about the ongoing war, but he suspected that his remarks may spark some tension, but he couldn't be bothered about that right now. His attention lay elsewhere. The tunnel they exited from was not the one they went in from, and so he had no idea which direction their camp was in. The lack of any celestial bodies in the sky made it impossible for him to determine the location he was heading in. The best he could do, currently, was climb a tree to determine the direction of the cliff and head that way. The task was harder than he expected, even when leaving Barry on the ground, not only because of his exhaustion, but because he had not given his body any rest after being wounded. Such strenuous exertion in such a wounded state only served to exacerbate the seriousness of his injuries. Lex was just thinking of how he would finally rest when he breached the forest canopy and froze. The cliff, as massive as it was easy to find. The searing clash between 2 forests, one aflame while the other fiercely resisting, was not a sight easily overlooked. If he ignored the trees that had uprooted themselves and seemed to be climbing the cliffs, and the hordes of birds that clashed in the skies, and even the countless beasts that seemed to be using the cliff as a battlefield, the boulders being flung towards Goli Forest were not so easy to escape because one could fall on him at any time. Safety consultant my arse, I'm going to be a painter when I return. While scouting the forest, Lex suddenly noticed another area in the forest that seemed unusually devoid of trees. After focusing for a bit, he realized it wasn't that there were no trees there, but that they had all been burnt down. He found the camp. For the first time ever, Lex praised Ptolemy and his green flames as he climbed back down the tree. He wasn't too far, and should be able to reach it fairly quickly if he ran. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 269 The Legend of Lex. The expedition camp was filled with an eerie silence, as everyone who was able stood guard with their weapons drawn. At first, when Ptolemy and the rest set out, all was normal. But when the war began, Goli's first target was the humans. They faced an assault the likes of which could fit in with the greatest legends in human history. Beasts, trees, flames, all assaulted them with passion hitherto unseen. But against all odds, with the fury of the world against them, the humans banded together and proved their resilience. There was no fear of death in their eyes as they battled the horde that had no end, no reluctance, only the one core value all humans in this realm had ingrained in them from birth. If they were going to die, then the enemy would die with them. In history, it is said that humans fought their greatest battle in the darkness, abandoned by the graceful light of the soul birds, abandoned by hope, abandoned by any notion of tomorrow. It was in the darkness that they forged the greatest of their legends, and it was from the darkness that the humans had clawed their way to becoming one of the 7 great races. But these students fought under the light of their enemies' burning leaves, under the glare of senseless hate, so that when their end came, they would see it coming. Hours later, when the strength of their limbs was leaving them, and the last of their swords were breaking, it was not the abyss that came for them, but Ptolemy and his group. Lizard astride, bloodied warriors tore through the enemy ranks behind the charge of their leader, shrouded in green flames. And when they finally reached the camp, Ptolemy made good on his promise of starting a forest fire. A flame so greedy it absorbed the yellow color of life itself engulfed the forest that surrounded them, and the wails of beasts filled the skies. Unable to counter such a sinister villain, Goli abandoned the area around the human camp and focused solely on Karam, for now. But even abandoned, the flames roared for hours until every last shred of life surrounding the camp was erased from existence. In the end, the humans finally had their rest. Many of them fell onto their knees, and then onto the ground. How many of them would ever get back up was a question no one had an answer to. No one asked about Lex and Barry, for in the chaos, who knew how many of them had gone missing? No, they only rested, as the camp doctors made their rounds, doing whatever their failing strength allowed. For who knew when the next battle would come down upon them? The once green and lush camp was now carpeted in ash, with tendrils of smoke rising up into the air all around. Movement from the front, a yell from a watchtower broke the silence, rousing all to their feet. They had come to the expedition as specialists in their fields, as geologists, doctors, cartographers and more, but none would regret ending the expedition as warriors dead on the field of battle. Ptolemy stood at the forefront of the camp, looking out towards the trees in the distance. Normally his vision would allow him to see unabated even at a greater distance, but through the gray smoke he could only see vague figures. Slowly, a crowd gathered behind him, swords and spears drawn, arrows nocked, shields at the ready. At the moment, no one blamed the expedition for being a failure. The truth was, if expanding to regions where entire human settlements had withdrawn from was easy, then it would never have been their turn to complete this task. Everything that happened, to some extent, was already expected. With the ever-present threat of the Craven hanging over their heads, the human race needed brave men and women to face the dangers of the unknown, and carve out the path to their survival. Just as Ptolemy tightened his grip on his sword, thinking about the fact that he had not yet recovered enough strength from the previous battle, a dark shape was outlined in the smoke. All the warriors turned their eyes to that approaching shape, as the scouts on the watchtower looked elsewhere to ensure they were not ambushed from another side. The dark figure in the smoke looked too alien to identify what creature it belonged to, but if it was following up after the previous attack, there was no doubt that it must be the forest's champion. Yet just as they hardened themselves to face whatever monstrosity emerged, from the smoke emerged a thin, charred creature that stumbled more than it walked. It seemed to be carrying something on its shoulder. But it only took a moment before the confusion was swept away and Ptolemy recognized that damned figure. More of a walking charcoal than a person, he would have never recognized the figure if it wasn't for those damned, determined eyes. Suddenly he recalled the rumors he had been hearing in camp, the stories that made him spit on the ground and somehow hate Lex even more. No, not rumors, legends. Legends of a lone human who walked through the carnage of Gristle and gathered a group of survivors, fighting an endless horde of enemies until they were saved by the representatives of the Academy. Legends of how, when they faced an ambush, the human stood tall and strong against the flesh of an immortal craven, teeth bared as if ready to bite, his knees unwilling to bend even in the face of death. He recalled the legend of the human throne in the path of the Coulter Flug, to a village destined to be erased from memory, which, ironically, became a village whose name people would never forget. It was the village where that human stood his ground against a calamity of nature and even dared to attack the strongest Coulter Flug that caused a vice dean of the Academy some trouble, all to protect his fellow humans. Ptolemy recalled legends of the man so distraught with his weakness, he worked all day and all night to grow stronger, so he would never fail again. He recalled the legend of the human that had forsaken his surname so as not to rely on the prestige of his forefathers. He recalled the legend of Lex, noble son of Gristel, suspected heir of Cornelius II. Despite all the frustration he had felt towards the man, as he watched the charred body of the irritating plebeian that refused to die, carrying on his back a cultivator much stronger than himself, he couldn't help but believe the legends for a moment. "Call the doctors," Ptolemy told the crowd that was still ready to fight. "They're with us. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone." Chapter 270 The Return of Booty. Lex's journey to the camp was, for the lack of a better word, boring. A few times he ran into a few beasts, and just as he was preparing to give an explanation to avoid a fight, or perhaps even run away, the beasts would only nod at him and move away. How was he supposed to know that he was being identified as a mutated mole? So in the end, the return ended up being him carrying the exhausted Barry through the forest for hours until he finally reached the camp. He hadn't had any time yet to think about his future plans, but this incident would surely affect them. Just as he was about to enter the camp though, Mary gave him an update about something happening at the inn that put him in a foul mood. He was cursing and whining internally, not realizing that he had made it to camp. This led to the misunderstanding where his eyes full of frustration were mistaken for unwavering determination by Ptolemy. This was a misunderstanding destined to never be cleared up, for when would two men actively talk about the expression in each other's eyes? As matters at the inn didn't actually require his attention, he put the matter behind him as he refocused on the matter at hand. It was only when the doctors came and wrapped him and Barry in blankets that he actually realized he was nude. They started testing him and applying various salves on his skin, but it was only when he saw them prick his skin and he felt nothing that he realized that he had no sensation. Well, maybe considering the circumstances, that was for the better. The doctors asked him some questions, and when he tried to answer, he discovered once again how difficult it was to speak. If he forced himself, like he had with the apes, he would release a grotesque, hoarse sound that did not sound human, so in the end they stopped asking him questions for now. During the entire process, Lex felt nothing, and in fact was once again bored so much so that he hoped he could fall asleep or at least faint so he could in a way fast forward this process. But to his viewers, Lex showed a silent resilience, and refused to utter a single wince even as his burnt and battered body was treated. Surrounded by valiant warriors who had fought off death and destruction with tooth and nail, it was instead Lex who did nothing but run, whose legend once again began to grow. Accompanied by the already positive impression everyone had of Lex, everyone was more than happy to fill in the blanks of his no doubt perilous journey with the most arduous of trials. Of course, Ptolemy refused to be one of those. So what if he was the heir to Cornelius too? The king had lived for hundreds of years, had thousands of wives and concubines and literally had tens of thousands of children. He never favored any until they made real, quantifiable contributions to the human race. It was actually because of how little he cared for his children that made the story of relinquishing his family name more believable. Who could know the real reason Lex never gave his family name was because he was seriously creeped out by the guy interviewing him, and didn't want to give him any accurate information. In the end, one of the doctors gave Lex a powerful sedative and put him to sleep. Barry, however, did not receive the same treatment. This was not because they were being harsh on him, but because he would be able to communicate with his spirit sense at least, and Ptolemy really needed to know the details of what happened. But Barry was in much better condition than Lex, and after being given a dose of stimulants, quickly recovered. He did not need to use his spirit sense, and told the tale of how Lex saved him multiple times, from somehow bringing them out of the cave-in, to guiding him to avoid danger, to carrying him after he thoroughly exhausted himself. Ptolemy, of course, was no longer listening. He had gotten the news he was hoping for: the spirit well existed. One of the many objectives of the expedition was to locate valuable resources. Since he was hunting for resources, naturally the resources had been allocated ranks and value quantifiers. Spirit wells, while not being the highest value target, were still high on the list since about only 1 in 100 mines ever even had the chance to become one. It was high enough that, using the potential danger to the well due to the ongoing war, he could request Academy intervention. Naturally, the Academy would not interfere in the struggle between the Trollops, but as this was still the human domain, they retained the rights to any valuable resources. Distribution rights would be discussed later, for that had nothing to do with Ptolemy. He only had to report the situation back to the Academy, and they would send someone over to secure the well, and, hopefully, take that irritating Lex away considering his situation. "Midnight in, Gemerestan. I'll murder your whole clan," roared a wrinkled old man, dressed in traditional Dowsit clothes. His beard, hundreds of feet long and previously wild and untamed, now bore the signs of having been treated by Harry and braided in Viking fashion. His weapon, an 8 feet, 2.4 meters, long spear, leaned against the wall, gathering dust. Instead, the tool he was using to inflict damage was a controller. His character in immortal combat was constantly being beaten by his opponent, who used the forbidden technique of repeatedly doing low attacks that knocked him back. He did not know how to block low attacks, nor did he know how to attack low either, the cause of his frustration. "Old man, you're my father. Does that mean you'll kill yourself?" yelled back another man who looked equally old. In fact, he was also dressed similarly and had a weapon that looked almost identical to his father, so that the two looked more like twins than parents and child. He was instead fighting using a mouse and keyboard, the superior option. Hundreds of viewers gathered around them and hooted and chanted for the ones they supported. The group looked like they were taken from a Comic-Con convention, as they were too varied and unique to look like they came from the same place. In the end, the son won the round, using his forbidden technique, launching his supporters into a frenzy. "Do not be so smug, child, for the journey to victory is long and filled with obstacles. The proverbs of a failure who could not even get past the qualifying rounds mean nothing to me," replied the son, as he ran his hands down his new beard braid. The father, enraged, snorted before he left with his weapon. While the father-son match ended quickly, many matches in the gamer's den were still going on. A gaming tournament organized by Booty, the pirate, was taking place. After the Ironheart pirates discovered the inn, they began using it on and off until one of them had the idea to sell the keys as treasures. Their business was good, since they visited numerous space stations and planets on their journey to loot and pillage. After they had distributed the keys to many places, however, it occurred to Booty that they could take things a step further. Immediately, he sent out a message to his entire network, and they organized a friendly tournament over some of the video games Booty liked. The idea was an instant success, and hundreds of people paid a good deal of money. It made sense, for not everyone who was a cultivator was highly motivated. After living over 100 years, most people would actively pursue new forms of entertainment. Of course, Booty specifically targeted the non-problematic people from his network for this tournament. He didn't want to risk a fight breaking out over disagreements and then being blamed by the inn staff for it. It was the entrepreneurial efforts of Booty that saw a sudden spike in new inn guests, and what's more, ended up in a gaming tournament for contestants from around a galaxy. Lex was extremely bitter over missing the tournament, for he wanted to be there for it. Z was also bitter, because the gamer's den had never been more popular, and he didn't like being around so many people. Another round of cheers erupted as an intense match finally came to a close. As for what game they were playing? Call of Duty, modern capitalism too. There were a few tournaments happening concurrently, and this game was the one that had the highest anticipated finale. That was because, in one qualifying bracket was a team from Earth formed by famous YouTubers who just happened to be visiting the inn, while in the other, soldiers trained to remotely operate combat robots in active war zones. To them, this was more than just a game. It was a matter of pride. And good quality content for their channels. No one would back down. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 271 Peculiarities. 3 days passed before the representative for the Academy finally arrived. The war did not cease for even a moment, but fortunately, the humans were left alone during this time. The rep had a long meeting with Ptolemy wherein he conducted a detailed interview of everything that had happened so far, as well as the reason for summoning him. Once he learned about the spirit well, he picked up Ptolemy to guide him, and directly flew over the forest until they reached the tunnel. The original tunnel that Lex had discovered had collapsed, but it was not a problem for the rep to dig it up once again. Not bothering with any of the creatures in his path, he zipped through the tunnels as he followed the marker Barry had placed down by the well. When he reached the well, he checked the authenticity of the well, and then sealed it using a special talisman. No one would be able to access the well until the seal was removed, which was easier said than done. Naturally, any goo or monster or beast that protested against the seal met with a swift end. The details such as figuring out the size of the well, how it would be used, who would be allocated the rights to harvest the water all were someone else's responsibility. He was just there to verify the report to the Academy. He would not help the expedition too much, as this was also a kind of graduation test for these students, nor would he interfere with the Trollops War, as that was not his job. In the future, should Goli refuse to compromise and insist on keeping the spirit well, then someone else would be sent to deal with him. The matter would be handled in a way that best served human interests. But, while he did not interfere, the timing of the war was too coincidental, so it required further investigation. The representative was not exactly polite with his investigation either. With his superior cultivation, it was not a problem at all finding the Trollops' real bodies, not the leaf humanoid form or snake form the Trollops liked to show the world. He did not bother sharing the result of his investigation with Ptolemy, but considering the fact that the war continued as it had previously, there must not have been any big issues. It was time for him to return, and he was supposed to bring all the seriously injured members of the expedition as well, as they were no longer fit to continue. But one of the doctors stopped him. To be more specific, the doctor that had been looking after Lex. "I have to report some special circumstances relating to the patient," the doctor said with a lot of hesitation in his voice. "What's the matter?" the rep asked without dismissing the doctor. Normally, it was unlikely for something like a patient's condition to be relevant to someone like him, but he trusted the competence and professionalism of the academy students. The patient in question is at the Chi training level, and suffered severe burns and blunt force trauma from being smashed into a pool of lava by a collapsing wall. Furthermore, his body's condition was worsened during escape, where he carried an incapacitated student back to the camp. Under normal circumstances, with injuries like these, we would not expect full recovery, ever, and partial recovery would take well up to a year at least, if he managed to live that long at all. However, not only is the patient's recovery the fastest I've ever seen, there are a few factors that don't strictly adhere to common medical logic with the patient. "Show me," the rep said, reserving his final judgment until the report was complete. The doctor led the red into a medical tent where Lex was being treated separately from all the other patients. His body was floating 3 feet in the air over a white marble platform on the ground, and various tubes were connected to his body. He had been kept sedated this entire time, as the doctors expected Lex would go into shock if he saw the actual situation of his body. With all the char, dirt and grime cleaned from his body, you could now see that he looked more like a diagram for the human cardiovascular system than a living person. This was because he had nearly no skin left and was wrapped in a white gauze that was mostly see-through. Where his skeleton was exposed, visible cracks ran through the bone. The rep was not a squeamish man, but even he was surprised by what he saw. "You say he's recovering the fastest? What was he like before this?" "Much, much worse," the doctor replied gravely. "A lot of the meat on his body was cooked, rocks and dirt had stabbed through his organs and he had completely drained all his chi. I honestly have no idea how he was even able to run from the tunnel all the way back to the camp. A normal man would have died a million times over just from the exertion from breathing, let alone carrying someone else." Silence once again filled the tent for a moment, before the doctor continued. "But, that's not why I brought you here. I was the first to notice the patient's peculiarities, and so I ordered that I alone would take care of this patient to keep the matter from getting out. Let me show you the first peculiarity," the doctor said before turning Lex around. Since Lex's body was floating in the air, turning him around was easy, but the moment his back was exposed it became evident what the issue was. Just because his back hadn't been directly exposed to the lava didn't mean it suffered no burns. But, while his back carried various degrees of injuries, there was a patch of skin on his back completely unblemished, except for a tattoo of a lotus on it. Not only did his skin around the tattoo not suffer any burns, the doctor said, his eyes stuck on Lex's back, but even his spine directly below the tattoo remained completely unharmed. I suspect this played a major role in him being able to come back to the camp on his own 2 feet. The rep, now truly curious, scanned Lex's back, and his body, thoroughly. But the system was able to hide itself even from Balaam. This rep was no obstacle. The lotus, on the other hand, did not even try to hide, its existence was on a completely different realm compared to the rep, let alone the lotus. The rep could not even sense the various energies the lotus was always absorbing to feed itself. "What else?" the rep asked, when he was unable to find anything out of the ordinary in Lex's body. "This next bit is truly remarkable. Like I told you, the patient is recovering faster than I've seen anyone recover, and that was no exaggeration. You see all these tubes connected to him? Only one of them carries any medicine, the rest are all nutrition solutions. This is because any medicine we give him, no matter what kind, is thousands of times more effective on him than it should be, and is actively recovering his body so fast. If we don't feed him with these nutrition solutions, he will literally starve to death. I have a theory about why this is so, but I can't think of a way to prove the theory yet. You see, when we administer medicine, any medicine, not all of it is being used. If we're really lucky, maybe a few % of the medicine will be absorbed and properly work as intended while the rest never makes it to the targeted area, or is even excreted from the body as waste. Yet, based on my study of the patient, I believe that regardless of what kind of medicine we administer, it is being used up to 100% of its capacity." The doctor had excitement and fervor in his eyes, but this was much less impressive to the rep than the back tattoo. While the truth of the matter was that the lotus was using any and all ingredients absorbed by Lex to best help him recover, going even beyond the 100% theoretical efficiency of the medicine. The rep had a completely different understanding of the situation. "This is a gap in your knowledge," the rep patiently explained to the doctor. "You've focused your study on general medicine, and so have a limited understanding of the various cultivation techniques. Your patient is clearly a body cultivator. There is nothing unusual about him having elevated recovery and absorption. Was there anything else you meant to report?" The doctor naturally understood the advantages of body cultivation, and knew this went beyond that, but could not argue with the rep. "The final thing is about the patient's cultivation. Considering the state of his body, I thought it would collapse, but if not, the best should have been him being able to keep his cultivation. However, based on his absorption rate of qi, and the state of his body, I estimate that by the time he recovers completely, he will have reached the peak of qi training. I and many others from the camp can verify that he was not at that level at the time he entered the tunnels." "All right," the rep replied impassively, giving nothing of his thoughts away. "If that's everything, I'll be taking him back to the academy now." With his tasks completed, the academy representative returned, flying out of the forest and over the ongoing war. While he was flying though, he started to write a letter from his personal terminal to Vernan, the crazy man responsible for Lex's insane tests. "I think I found an interesting one for you," he wrote, not knowing that Vernan had long been paying attention to Lex. "The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone." Chapter 272. Oh honey. Lex woke up feeling extremely well rested. There was no stiffness in his body, no bed sores, and if anything, he felt thoroughly reinvigorated. He drowsily picked himself up and stretched while letting out a massive yawn that forced him to close his eyes. When he was done stretching, he wiped the accumulated sleep dust from his eyes. He just felt like he just woke up from the best nap of his life. He looked at his fair, spotless hands and felt there was something strange about them. It took him a moment to realize he had no hair on his arm. Had he waxed recently? Just as he tried to recall, memories of what he had last experienced came flooding back. The emotions he felt from being boiled in lava were still locked away, so after impassively going over everything, Lex focused on the next important thing. He checked how much energy he had managed to accumulate after all that hassle, and was pleasantly surprised to discover a huge 2.5% accumulation. The accumulation was not bad at all, but in the process he had also lost a lot. The heavy Harley was gone, the fancy monocle, that one really hurt Lex. More than once the monocle had directly saved his life, and it had helped him tremendously otherwise as well. In fact, had it not been for the monocle, he would have never found the tunnel leading to the spirit well in the first place. He would need to figure out some other way to detect or scan things. He had also lost basically every other personal item that he had. The expensive inks he bought for using arrays. Just as Lex was wallowing in the losses he suffered, the white curtain around his bed was pulled aside and a familiar, smiling face welcomed Lex. "Good morning, sleepyhead. I know I asked to see you again, but you can see me too without coming in as a patient," said Honey, the nurse that took care of Lex the last time as well. "I'll keep that in mind for next time," Lex said with a smile, but his hoarse voice ruined the effect he was trying to create. Honey giggled as she approached Lex and started giving him a checkup. "You've recovered quite well. I thought it would take months, at least, but it's barely been a few weeks and you're as good as new." "A few weeks?" Lex asked, suddenly realizing he had no idea how much time had passed. Honey stuck out her tongue, realizing she had made a mistake, but then slowly explained Lex's condition on arrival, the treatment he received and how long it had been. Throughout the course of treatment Lex was kept unconscious on purpose to relieve him from the pain he would feel during the healing process. Many things that Honey told Lex surprised him. Learning the true condition of his body surprised him, because honestly, he genuinely didn't feel like he was on the verge of death like everyone kept claiming. This matter went beyond not being able to feel pain because of lost nerve endings. As a cultivator, he had an inherent understanding of his body and the seriousness of his wounds. He could only attribute the situation to how his body was a combination of his body, spirit and soul. He was much more resilient than it seemed. The matter that shocked him most, however, was how quickly he healed. This was contrary to his understanding of his body, and genuinely confused him. He didn't even need to ask to know that it wasn't the system that helped him, for that was not how the system worked. But, even with his relatively quick healing, when he calculated the amount of time he had spent, Lex could not help but let out an audible sigh. Honey, who was doing her best to give Lex her cheeriest smile and keep his mood positive, couldn't help but look at Lex with compassion. She could not even imagine what he must have gone through to get so gravely wounded. Surely he also lost a few partners in the endeavor. It must have been tough. She squeezed his hand a bit and warmly said, "Hey, what's with the sad look? I haven't even told you the best part yet. Apparently, you've accrued quite a reward." I was told to let you know not to break through the Foundation realm before you see Instructor Vernan. He has something for you that should help with your breakthrough. Huh? Lex was confused by what she said until he paid attention to his cultivation. His body currently contained 76 chi, which was almost the limit of the 7th level of chi training. But, more importantly, he did not feel the usual bloatedness that came with filling his body with the maximum amount of chi he could hold. Had his cultivation somehow grown? Did he really grow stronger by getting beaten up? Was he going to have to walk down the path of a masochist? Lex pushed away all his thoughts, he was not thinking clearly, and turned his attention to Honey. So what's my situation now? Am I good to go? Almost. Your results are all clear, and you've almost completely healed, but we'll keep you under observation till tomorrow. After that, you're good to go. Why? Is there anywhere you need to be? I was thinking we could go and grab some lunch, and I could show you what I'm like when I'm not a patient. Ha! Honey laughed loudly, despite trying to control herself. My time off work is very precious, Mr. Lex. You're going to have to try harder than that if you want to see me off work. Although, if you're hungry, I'll get someone to bring you some food. Lex smiled weakly. He was not actually trying to ask Honey out, as nice as she was, for he was too preoccupied with working to get back to the inn. A part of him was also sure that Honey wasn't actually interested in him, but just had a friendly personality. Whatever it was, after conversing a little more, she left him to go check on his other patients, and Lex properly organized his thoughts while feasting on. He had no idea what he was eating, but it was some kind of soup. After some deduction, Lex only came to one conclusion about why his body had healed so quickly. Hey Lotus, he said, once again lightly tapping his tattoo. Did you speed up my body's reconstruction? Yes, Mr. Innkeeper. I sensed that you were reconstructing your body, and so I helped a little. I sensed that the makeup of your body was too wasteful and too inefficient, so I made some alterations. There was a special alloy in the tunnel that was extremely malleable, and very good at conducting spiritual energy, so I remade your meridians with that. Previously, your meridians were made from some carbon-based material which was very fragile. I sensed the remains of a special lens that had great optical features, so I integrated that into your left eye. There was some metal. The Lotus very excitedly told Lex all the alterations it made to his body, like a child showing a parent some macaroni art. In its opinion, it was only flexing its natural instincts to create just a bit, for compared to what its abilities would grow into, it truly was unskilled at the moment. However, unskilled as it was, it had completely altered the makeup on a living being without affecting its life, or abilities in any negative way whatsoever. Lex had no idea if the reason all the Lotus alterations were successful was because of the unique state of his body, or because it was just that skilled, but his gut feeling told him it was the latter. He refrained from actually letting the Lotus know that it had helped heal Lex instead of helping him reconstruct his body, as it assumed he was doing. He only commended it on a job well done before he turned his attention to other matters. Internally, he was both horrified and amazed. As long as he had the Lotus with him in the future, any time he got injured, he could take its aid in healing him. He just had to keep in mind that, even with the Lotus help, he could not heal overnight, as it had still taken him weeks to recover this time. Though, that was the extent he planned on relying on the Lotus, for he did not know if extensive alterations to his body had adverse effects. Next, he turned his attention towards the inn. With 2.5% energy, he could now implement some of the changes he had planned earlier that would help him in the long run. He also had to plan for his latest 2 employees, the Sword and the Lich. In the time Lex was unconscious, the Sword had also managed to complete its trial and became an employee, though based on its condition, Lex could surmise that it had barely done so. Chapter 273 Security. A lot of time had passed with Lex unconscious, and it was fortunate that so far that the rascals had not caused any trouble, but Lex no longer wanted to leave things to chance. With enough energy, as well as 2,845,000 MP due to his income of nearly 243,000 MP from all the guests entering due to the gaming tournament, he was ready to implement some changes. Firstly, he finally put to use the security room he received as a quest reward for exposing the devil's plot to plant trackers on his various guests. Unlike the private rooms he could give to his workers, the security room required a physical location. To keep it private and away from his guests, he put down the security room beside the greenhouse, and then immediately spent 500,000 MP on upgrading the room to level 5, one level above his regular authority. The security room had a few vital functions, and the upgrades not only strengthened them but also added a few new ones. First and foremost, the security room could immediately detect anyone who had any malicious intent not only towards the inn or its staff, but towards other guests as well. How the security room detected them was beyond Lex's understanding, but after identifying a threat, the security room could perform a very basic form of the scan function to let security best decide how to deal with the threat. Secondly, just by existing, the security room allowed any staff registered as guards to directly communicate with one another across the inn seamlessly. This made it much easier to coordinate than having Mary pass out instructions to each one of them. Thirdly, the additional upgrade Lex got allowed his guards to teleport to the location of another guard quickly. Once again, it was a watered-down version of Lex's own teleportation abilities, but it was good enough. Fourthly, having the security room made various penalties available to Lex, as well as to his guards. Misconduct by a guest towards other guests or staff could allow them to now issue a temporary or permanent ban from entering the inn. Believe it or not, this was the first time Lex was getting this ability. Fifth, and perhaps what Lex cared about most right now, the security room could track associates for offenders, regardless of whether the associates were at the inn at the time of the offense or not. This meant that as soon as someone related to the rascal attack entered the inn, the security room would alert the guards as well as Lex. Finally, the security room gave all the guards some basic strength and defense buffs, as well as some special equipment and uniforms. As Gerard was the head of security, Lex let him pick how many workers he wanted to hire for the position, and gave him the option of selecting existing employees or hiring/creating new ones. Gerard ended up picking someone named Chad to be his deputy, and Lex used all the strength he could to avoid cracking up at that. Gerard immediately began to work, as it surprised Lex to learn that there were well over 20 guests with malicious intent towards the inn staying there immediately. However, they kept it to their intent and did not take any action, for now. After looking into it, Lex let out a defeated sigh. 19 of the 20 guests were thinking of urinating in the lazy river, but as soon as they even considered it, they felt intense danger. It seemed, for certain things, the system did not need instruction to prevent. Lex paused for a second, as it suddenly occurred to him that sometimes the system exhibited behavior outside of its usual crankiness, or insulting him. He was reminded of the time the galactic turtle was automatically hired, even though he was leading up to that, anyway. Preventing public urination was also good, but considering all the rules it put in place for Lex, something like giving guests a threatening feeling should not have been possible. It was something to think about. He already had various suspicions towards the system. He could not outright call it evil or malevolent since it was helping him out a lot technically, but he didn't quite believe it had no purpose either. This thought only bothered him for a second, for this was yet again another thing he could do nothing about with his current strength. It was just something to remember for now. Then, using his advanced authority, he purchased a building that he technically hadn't gained access to yet, the library. Sustaining the library would be a huge drain on his energy, but fortunately Lex was not planning on using most of its features, which saved him a lot of energy. The library was a monumentally important building at the inn, for when guests from around the universe stayed, providing entertainment or distractions was crucial. Its importance was proportional to its size, as it had taken the shape of a massive castle, similar in design to the Red Fort in India, connected to Main Street by a diverging road. The majesty of the building and the intricacy of the artwork spoke volumes about the importance it was given. It was not an invisible pedestal of importance that the inn gave to the preservation and impartation of knowledge, but a structure too glorious for even kings. The library, when it was operational, required a librarian, for which there would be stringent requirements, as well as knowledge on topics far and wide. Lex did not think for even a moment that he had even 1% of the knowledge required to open the library. He did, however, have a historian. A single branch of the library would be open, and would contain the history of the various planets and star systems connected to the inn. The purpose of opening a library, for Lex, was twofold. Firstly, the commonly known history of each planet would be openly available for any of his guests to peruse, after Anita filled it in, of course. Secondly, while Anita had been stuck interviewing guests and staff to learn various histories so far, now she had a special privilege. Following certain rules of non-interference and maintaining anonymity, she could travel to the various planets connected to the inn. This would be much more helpful in recording down the history of the planets than interviewing a few select guests. But, as a pregnant woman, Lex had no intention of sending her around the universe to conduct interviews. She could just summon her undead and send them on her behalf, it was all the same. Not to mention, he had already seen the kind of undead she summoned. No one would ever be able to determine the truth of their nature just by looking at them. Next, it was time for Cowain. He was to be a sword instructor. Guests could hire him for guidance in helping them learn special techniques, figuring out their flaws, or just pointing them in the correct direction for exponential growth. Of course, while his services could be paid for, it was completely at his own discretion. Not only were his services the most expensive to acquire, a guest had to earn Cowain's approval before he could even consider spending his money. Unlike his wife, who had a location provided by the system, there was no integrated swordsman room or anything of the sort ready for deployment. So, after having Mary consult the sword itself, Lex created a very dramatic spot for Gawain's dojo. A sword/cut vertically across the entire body of Midnight Mountain was formed, leaving behind a dark and narrow, yet prominent corridor. The corridor, imbued with some of Gawain's own sword intent, led deep into the mountain itself, where it opened up into a hall seemingly carved directly into the mountain rock. These were some of the more normal things Lex did with his authority. Next were the few things that would really take advantage of his increased authority as well as energy. He disabled random teleportation of guests, and made sure all new guests arrived at the front gates, as far as they may be from all the other main buildings. Then, he spent an entire 1% of the energy on upgrading the formation he placed here during the assault of the rascals that prevented anyone from leaving. Now, not only was the formation much sturdier, it could selectively let people enter or exit as well as obtained a suppression function. This may seem a simple enough use for an entire 1% of the energy it would require for Lex to travel back from another realm, but that just spoke to the new strength of the formation. He doubted even Gawain could damage it now. Just as he was feeling proud of his work, and was about to turn his attention elsewhere, Mary alerted him to a very serious issue one of his guests was having. The guest was a proud centaur from Nibiru called Thurblase, and when Lex scanned him, he saw in his eyes a look of a man on the verge of death. Chapter 274. A Deal with the Devil. Lex observed the centaur for a moment, for he had yet to see one before. He fit the build of every cartoon or animation of a centaur he had ever seen, except that he never realized how big they would end up being. Thurblase had long, red hair falling down his human back, their fiery color perhaps the inspiration for the blaze in his name. The centaur, of course, could not see Lex, as he had just made his complaint to his personal assistant and was waiting for a response. "What's the issue?" Lex asked as he inspected the guest. His hands were clenched tight and his jaw was squeezing hard, showing the veins running down his neck. "The guest needs to use the restroom, but the toilet is designed for humans." Mary could not look Lex in the eyes as she gave her report, and Lex was not drinking anything, but he felt like he just sprayed out something, anyway. Remembering the deathly look in the centaur's eyes, Lex felt a tide of sympathy for the guest and quickly looked at the system and found an upgrade for his toilets. For a measly 4,000 MP, he bought an upgrade for all his toilets so that they would automatically adjust themselves according to the guest that rented the room or wanted to use them. Too embarrassed to focus on the topic any longer, Lex didn't ask Mary why they'd never run into a situation like this before. If he had, the answer would have been very predictable. As cultivators grew in strength, their body's ability to absorb and process food, or anything else absorbed, grew to levels where they hardly needed to relieve themselves anymore. However, certain races, such as centaurs, had a more complex biological structure and, well, long story short, their need for restrooms would never disappear. With the matter taken care of, Lex put away his thoughts about the inn, and finally feeling no anxiety over security for the inn, and being safe himself, felt himself relax in a way he hadn't in a long time. Originally, he was planning on cultivating a bit, but he decided to sleep instead. It wasn't the best idea to cultivate in public places, anyway. The following day he was discharged, and after some friendly banter with Honey, he finally left. He only had a few things on his agenda for the day, and finding out about his so-called reward was first on the list. He had forgotten about how massive the academy was, and once again, taking public transport that took forever was starting to annoy him after the novelty wore off. There had to be a better way to get around. When he reached his destination, he walked into an office building and towards Instructor Vernon's room. During his time at the academy, he had learned a lot about the special forces Vernon had once told him about, and had learned about Vernon as well. The Crystal Realm was anything but simple, and the Hum Nation, representing one of the 7 major races of the realm, was not so simple either. The division of power was also complicated, and while as a whole the entire nation was focused on warring with the Craven, maintaining that cohesion was also a monumental task. While the royal family, other noble families, national and county-level armies and a plethora of private entities had established a complicated and interlinked power distribution, there was only one entity focused on keeping the peace within the nation itself, the academy. It may seem unusual for an educational institute to take care of policing a nation. The truth of the matter was the academy was much more than an educational facility. The most direct example was that the academy directly took in all survivors from Bristol to provide them basic amenities and a new direction in life. On surface level, it may seem like the academy was using these people with nothing to lose for all their worth, but an observation at a deeper level would note that people who went through such deeply traumatic experiences would, to a degree, become unstable themselves. By bringing them to the academy, they were put into a controlled environment where not only could they get medical and psychological help, the academy would help them cope by keeping them incredibly busy. If they were too busy to think, they were too busy to wallow in regret. Similarly, the academy took care of numerous issues plaguing the nation that weren't directly related to the Craven, and somehow, in the process of dealing with them, did not forget to propagate their narrative about the war. These were not things anyone told Lex, these were conclusions he made on his own. This was because the Special Forces designation was a general term, and both the military and the academy had their own special forces that dealt with various issues. Lex naturally did not know that Vernon had already pegged Lex to enter the special operations group called Red Hands. In his opinion, Vernon wanted to guide Lex into the kind of special forces that would deal with high-risk human targets within the nation. In a way, Lex's evaluation of what Vernon wanted was actually safer than what was actually planned. Still, Lex had no intentions of getting dragged by the maniac into his schemes. He just wanted the reward, and that's it. Putting on his passive, emotionless face, Lex knocked on Vernon's door and entered when he heard an excited, "Come in." The office looked quite mundane, very unsuited for the unstable man who occupied it. Sitting comfortably behind a desk, Vernon was holding a physical file with the name Lex printed out in bold in one corner. Other than Vernon's immediate surroundings, the office looked too neat and clean. It was to the point where Lex could not detect any dust in the room, regardless of what surface he looked at. Immediately, he got the impression that this office was almost never used, and was more of a staging area. Not bothering to say anything, he stood there silently until the man who was posing became impatient. He put down the file and acted surprised to see who had come into his room. "Oh, you, I remember you. You're the kid whose assessment started in Fernine Village." Ignoring his comment, Lex said, "I was told to come see you for some reward." "Reward? Oh wait, don't tell me, were you the kid who, while in the Chi training realm, surrounded by golden core and nascent cultivators, found a spirit well, went underground to locate it, marked the location and then returned to camp while saving a higher-leveled cultivator?" Lex continued to look at the man impassively, and did not respond to him in any way. The more you reacted to people like this, the more you would encourage their behavior. Vernon, despite his original script, chuckled and threw the file away. He stopped acting, for he wasn't too good at it anyway, and looked at Lex in the eyes. Since Lex had been in the academy for so long, his psychological evaluation had been updated, and Vernon now knew exactly how he should deal with Lex. Leading him by the nose would only cause him to resist, in which case, "You have a talent for survival, kid. Even more than I expected. And you have drive, you have ambition. I don't know if it's revenge against the Craven you're after, or something else. But the way you forced yourself to work in your first month here, I know you're after something. As it so happens, so am I. So let's not beat around the bush, kid, let's just get down to it. Tell me what you want, what you need." The assessment program in the academy is focused on squeezing out the potential of average students, but for people like you, who have the drive to squeeze out their own potential, it's just a distraction. That's where people like me come in. I can change your classes, change your designation, do whatever I want, as long as it furthers your cause. So don't be shy, let's talk like adults, kid. Despite his resolution to not give in to Vernon's antics, the bait he threw was too tempting. If Lex could really choose his own classes, and his own direction for growth, it would help him tremendously. But, that was not enough to get Lex to lower his guard. He would not bet his life away to play into someone else's hands. "And what do you get from that?" he asked, looking Vernon in the eyes. "What do I get? Kid, you have tremendous potential, but right now, you're not even qualified to even dream of being useful to me. So, I want to help you grow. To nurture you. To strengthen you into the finest blade and the strongest shield. Because what I want is not something as simple as killing Craven, we have soldiers for that kind of stuff. I want to create a living nightmare that will haunt the Craven from their dreams to their reality. So don't worry about me, kid. As long as you keep showing the potential to grow more, then all I want from you is to keep on growing." Chapter 275. Sometimes, size matters. "Very eloquent way of avoiding the answer," Lex said, not letting his thoughts show. Of course, internally, he had already decided. Whatever long-term goals Vernon had meant nothing to Lex, for if everything went according to plan, he would be long gone by then. This was because there was one very important detail involved in this transaction that was not mentioned, because it was considered common knowledge in the crystal realm. Since everyone, at least in the academy, was a cultivator, they had a much longer average life expectancy than humans from Earth. The average academy graduate was a golden core cultivator, who normally had a life expectancy of around 250 years. Keeping that in mind, the average student spent well over 15 years in the academy before they graduated, since the course was much larger than then. Vernon paused, then smiled. The more wary Lex was, the more Vernon liked him. "The ideal situation would be for you to join the army," Vernon said finally. "But I can see that you don't like being forced, which is fine. My ultimate goal is to create as many experts at the highest level as possible, so long as they help the nation. Even indirect help from a single immortal is often worth more than a million nascent cultivators' efforts." Lex did not immediately reply, and furrowed his brows as if he was considering something difficult. Internally, though, he was already planning on what classes he wanted to take. Vernon too was gloating in his mind, for as far as he was concerned, his only objective right now was to have Lex drop his guard and agree to him once. So long as a precedent was established, getting Lex to follow along in the future would be much easier. His true purpose would be fulfilled then. Eventually, Lex relented and decided not to keep the matter hanging too long. "Fine, that is acceptable," was all he said before they began hashing out the details. Lex quickly thought of what his priorities were. He needed to accumulate energy, but to be able to go around exploring, the first thing he needed was to increase his survivability. For that, he needed to get stronger. He also focused on receiving more combat training, leadership skills, business management, learning more about the crystal realm and learning more about the Craven in particular. As much as he wanted to take even more subjects, such as a higher-level array class, he ended up having to refrain for one very important reason. Since he was taking more specialized classes, his basic academy covered allowance was no longer enough. He needed to pay some kind of tuition. Lex had no way of paying for his classes with money, for he barely had any. Fortunately, during the expedition, he ended up accumulating some academy credit. He could pay for classes with his credits, but the more classes he took, the quicker he would run out of those credits. So now, other than taking classes, he had to think of ways to either make a lot of money, or gather more credit. Those were all issues for another day, however, as at least during this next round of classes, Lex's tuition was covered. After that was complete, they discussed Lex's reward. For all of Lex's contributions, other than just the academy credit, he received some of the spirit water as well. Currently, it would be poisonous to Lex, but if he absorbed it, the exact moment he broke through to the Foundation realm, it would boost his cultivation by a large margin. Lex collected the small, sealed container with the spirit water and finally was free to return. He sent Amelia, his only close friend at the academy, a message from a new PT he got before he got on public transport and returned to his apartment. He did not focus on how depressingly bare the apartment was, considering all his belongings were lost or burnt. Lex took a shower and then sat down on his bed. He had only one thing left on his agenda for today: cultivation. Without wasting any time, Lex began cultivating because he was eager to know what his new limit was. But as the time started to pass, and from an hour it went to 2, and from 2 to 4, Lex never stopped cultivating. Not only was Lex absorbing chi seamlessly, he even felt, to a degree, that controlling it within his body had become easier. For a moment, around the time he was absorbing his 85th strand of chi, he became confused. Something was off. Even if his cultivation grew a little, it should not have grown so much. In chi training, the goal was to absorb chi slowly into the body, and start getting the body accustomed to the increased amount of chi. This was a slow process. Even his meridians, the network through which chi traveled within Lex's body, were being subject to spiritual energy for the first time, and so were supposed to be sensitive and could not. Suddenly, he remembered what the lotus told him. It had thought his meridians were too fragile, and so remade them with the alloy it found in the tunnel where Lex had been. While the lotus had not been specific, Lex knew exactly what alloy it was talking about. An adolescent druk strengthened its body by absorbing various ores, but an adult druk refined them into a special alloy that not only strengthened its body immeasurably, it was an excellent conductor for spirit energy, something they severely needed since having their body covered in metal made it difficult for them to sense the energy in the first place. If that alloy had been used to reforge his meridians, it seemed, for all intents and purposes, Lex had already surpassed the chi training realm, and all that was required now was for him to take the official steps. Still, not taking any risks, Lex continued to cultivate at a stable, measured pace. If things continued at this rate, then he would be in the Foundation realm by morning. Crystal Realm, the Academy, Praline Building. On the top floor of the massive skyscraper, a chaotic party was taking place. There was a band playing live music, hundreds of students dancing, a fighting arena right in the center of the dance floor, and hundreds of flying thimble fairies, not only absorbing the ever-present glare of the soul birds, but replacing them with a mellow, auburn light. The party was the subject of desire for tens of thousands of students, but the host was sitting in a private room, away from all the noise, watching the festivities through a camera. She was a young girl, maybe 17 or 18 years in age, with extremely prominent features. While she had long hair, on the right side she had shaved all her hair off, revealing a tattoo of a wolf, curled behind her ear. She had a couple of piercings on the left side of her lip, a scar that ran across her jaw and down her neck, as well as clear green eyes. Were she not radiating charisma and confidence, some may have considered her appearance too much. As things were, however, the worst thing one could possibly say about her appearance was that she only captivated them for a short while. That, too, was only because anyone who got caught staring at her would usually have their faces bashed in by her. "Quenhild, I heard some interesting news," said one of the dozens of followers she had. "It seems another one of your brothers has joined the academy." Quenhild gagged, as if to demonstrate what she thought about that. Quenhild Cornelius could not care less about her many siblings even if she actively tried. While the whole nation swooned after her father, she actively hated him and she was not subtle about her feelings. In fact, she had never even met the man. That's not the part that's interesting. What's interesting is, no one knows anything about his past, except that he's a war veteran and survivor of a craven invasion, facing off even immortals. Oh, and, somehow, he managed to drop his last name. Before the follower could even continue, he felt himself lifted into the air. Who is he? Where is he? How did he do it? Quenhild screamed, not in anger, but excitement. There was nothing of her usual dark demeanor, only the giddy excitement of a child about to open some presents. It had been a lifelong dream of hers to take up her mother's name instead of her father's, but even she dared not drop the name, for fear of the consequences. Outside the Vegas star system, on a juggernaut ship. He was ahead of schedule, but that was the way he liked it. With the Jotun Empire claiming control over all three invaded Vegas planets, he could now turn his attention to his new task. Of course, he did not leave the planets unattended. Between soldiers, administrators, workers, educators and more, Ragnar had left some 30 billion humans behind to expand their presence and integrate the Vegas natives into their empire. But that was all in the past now. His vision turned to the command carrier, the forward operating base for Jotun expeditions, and the ship that he commanded. The vessel was so large that it had to remain outside the star system, at a safe distance, lest it affect the gravity of the system and destroy the delicate equilibrium. How would one even begin to describe the size of this vessel that he used to travel across and even between galaxies? A comparison could be made with planets. The surface area of the planet Earth was around 197 million square miles, 510 million square kilometers, but just the ship hangar of this blimp-shaped vessel, where smaller spaceships such as the Juggernaut ships were parked, was bigger than that. Perhaps another comparison could be made by comparing it to a star. If the command carrier crashed head-on with the sun, it would continue to move, almost entirely undamaged, with the star being completely decimated. To explain the size and strength of this vessel, to say it was beyond the comprehension of mortals was enough. How many barren star systems had been mined dry to make this vessel, even Ragnar did not know. For why would he care? This was just one of many command carriers owned by the Empire. On the battlefield he was heading to, he would probably see more of them. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 276. A little bit. As the Juggernaut vessel docked into the command carrier, Ragnar thought back to his most recent visit to the inn. He just learned that the innkeeper was gone and, for the first time, felt a little curious what the innkeeper did when he was away. Was he opening up another inn? Or maybe he was dealing with a few problems. Well, it was a pity that they could not meet, but there was always next time. But perhaps it was for the best that Lex was not there for Ragnar's last visit. Otherwise he would have drowned in a sea of sorrow for not increasing the price of the golden keys, even just a little more than their cost price. After all, Ragnar just bought 300 million keys to distribute among some of the important personnel on his command carrier. After all, in a war zone, having a safe place to retreat to was invaluable. Lex cultivated all night long and, just as he suspected, reached 99 chi seamlessly. 99 chi strands was the absolute limit of chi training. There was no such concept as Lex absorbing more chi strands than normal just because his body could sustain the pressure, mainly because it was redundant. Whether it was 100, 200 or even a million strands of chi, individual strands of chi could do nothing against spirit energy in its natural state. Which is why, the process for the breakthrough to the Foundation realm began at the 100th strand of chi. Once it was absorbed, under the careful guidance of one's cultivation technique, the remaining 99 strands would blanket it, until the strands began to merge, and instead of chi strands, they would form a spiritual energy stream. Once the stream was formed was when the actual process of the breakthrough would begin, as the single stream would attract more and more spiritual energy. One might think that, since only a short while ago, even a moderately high concentration of spiritual energy was poisonous, absorbing so much energy would be bad for the cultivator. This would make sense if that's all there was to it. It was important to remember that cultivation and cultivation techniques were actually quite complicated, and a description of the behavior of chi or spiritual energy was just the surface-most layer of what was actually happening. So, the spiritual energy a cultivator would begin to absorb after forming an energy stream was not absorbed to increase cultivation, but to fuel the change that took place as a cultivator entered the foundation realm. In simple words, the cultivator would be undergoing a process of literally reaching a higher realm of existence, which would be fueled by the energy absorbed. This is also why Lex was given spirit water for his breakthrough. By drinking it at the time of his breakthrough, the conversion would be more thorough and provide him with long-lasting benefits. For Lex in particular, the conversion would be much greater, since it was affecting more than just his spirit. It was for that reason that he was taking so long to absorb the last strand. But, after making sure he was in peak condition for the third time, and making sure none of the chi he absorbed was acting volatile, he absorbed the last strand of chi. Everything that followed seemed to happen on autopilot. The chi was guided to his chest, and the rest of the strands that were spread throughout his body started to move towards it on their own. The chi strands began to join together and, in the smoothest way possible, fused to form a stream of spiritual energy, flowing throughout Lex's body. It was an endless stream, with no beginning and end, and flowed through Lex like an endless loop. Spiritual energy ebbed and flowed into the meridian branches leading to Lex's extremities. Lex almost lost himself in the ecstasy of spirit energy filling his entire body, but somehow managed to remember to drink the spirit water. That's when the hurricane began. Normally, the absorption process of spirit energy would be slow and measured, since the attracting force was exuded by the limited energy within the cultivator's body. But, fueled by the spirit water that Lex drank, the pull was turned from a gentle breeze to a natural calamity. The flow of spiritual energy in Lex's entire building was affected, and many people had to stop cultivating because the energy had gone into a frenzy. Lex could feel every inch of his body slowly getting stronger, somehow being enhanced into something beyond what he already was. This was also true for his meridians, which were already incredibly resilient, made from the special alloy as they were. He felt his consciousness being altered, and amidst the bizarre sensations that flooded his body, he felt more alive than he had ever been. Considering the fact that life was a product of a soul, and that his soul was literally becoming stronger, his feeling was technically true. The breakthrough, even as bombastic as it was, would not last too long and then it would be time for him to get accustomed to his new realm. But fate had different plans. Amelia finally checked her message after one of her classes and was ecstatic to learn about Lex's return. She made her way to his apartment to catch up and ask him all about his trip. Since she was coming directly after a class, she was dressed quite normally, but someone familiar with her may notice a light sparkle around her eyes and a gentle blush on her cheeks, an unusual addition. She was wearing something called fantasy skin, the equivalent of makeup in this realm. She noticed a particularly eye-catching girl enter the building before her, with beautiful brown hair and captivating green eyes. Amelia only caught a glimpse of her, so she did not think much of it, but when she reached Lex's floor, she saw the girl again. The girl was not alone, and was discussing the unusual behavior of spirit energy nearby with one of her two followers. When Amelia entered the floor, she and that girl exchanged glances for a moment, before looking away again. Neither of them were interested in the other, as they were not in the habit of snooping on random passers-by. But, when they both stopped in front of Lex's door, they realized they had the same destination. Amelia froze, for she did not recognize this girl, but she knew all of Lex's acquaintances well. Since he was such a focused and dedicated worker, he barely socialized with anyone other than her and her friends at the academy, so who was this? 100 different thoughts ran through her head, of which 99 were some form of girlfriend. Quenhild, on the other hand, deeply analyzed Amelia quite openly. She recognized the fantasy skin, as well as the fact that Amelia was quite an amateur in the field based on the way she used it. She checked her cultivation, her demeanor, her appearance and everything else before she snorted mentally. As a daughter of Cornelius, she had lived her whole life surrounded by people trying to get close to her because of her father. As such, she was extremely skilled in detecting people who had such intentions, and currently, Amelia was ticking a lot of boxes. "Hello, my name is Quenhild. I'm looking for Lex, is this his apartment?" she asked, politely. This was absolutely not Quenhild's normal attitude, but since she was coming to see Lex, a person who had pulled off something even she could not, she humbled herself a little. Amelia, Lex Frien. Yeah, this is his apartment. How do you know him? I have some business with Lex. He has an impressive record. Amelia felt this girl was strange and clearly had some kind of agenda. She looked a little younger than Amelia, but her piercings and tattoos screamed that she was bolder than her age would predict. Deciding to simply nod, Amelia knocked on Lex's door, which was followed by an awkward silence where no one responded. Maybe he's in the restroom, Quenhild commented as she stayed put, not indicating any sign of wanting to move. Naturally, if their cultivation was high enough, they would be able to detect that the spirit energy was being pulled into his room and deduce that he was having a breakthrough. As things were, they could only sense its odd behavior, not the direction of its flow. And so the two girls waited outside Lex's room, staring at one another. "And how do you know Lex?" Quenhild finally asked as well, trying to fill the silence. Her two followers maintained silence as if their only job was to stand guard. "It was quite funny actually, we met due to a misunderstanding," Amelie said with a smile, as she thought back to the moment Lex sat beside her for the first time. She was sure he was a shameless stalker. Lost in memory, she didn't even realize as she began to regale Quenhild with her story, filling in the blanks with her own misunderstandings and commentary. Did it seem like she was trying to show off the depth of her friendship with Lex to a potential rival? A little bit. Chapter 277. The food has arrived. Lex's breakthrough took around 20 minutes. The moment it was completed, Lex was momentarily overwhelmed by the immense burst of information he started receiving, but quickly adapted. His senses had become infinitely more sensitive, to the point where on his skin, he could even feel the subtle vibration of the blood flowing through his veins. He could hear his own breathing like a gale and see everything in such detail that he could not comprehend it. But the sensory overload lasted only a moment, for his brain quickly adapted, and as if he had been doing so his entire life, he started filtering out the information he didn't need subconsciously. It was exactly for this reason as well that he immediately picked up the muffled sounds of a prolonged conversation, even through the insulted material that made his door. Carefully, he got up from the bed, remembering the time when he started cultivating and almost destroyed his own apartment due to a lack of control. He tiptoed to the door and opened the door. He was pleasantly surprised to see Amelia, but also shocked by the overload of information he got from looking at Quenhild. His instincts were a lot stronger now, and he picked up on a lot more than just immediate danger to himself. He could tell just by being in her proximity that she was extremely dangerous, and at the same time, that she could do absolutely nothing to him. Likewise, Amelia, who was somewhere towards the peak of the Foundation realm, suddenly posed no threat to him at all. At the same time, he picked up a strange feeling from her, as if she were uncomfortable or nervous or something. "Amelia, what are you doing here so late?" he asked, temporarily ignoring Quenhild. "I just got done with class and I saw your message, so I came to see you. The way you just showed up without sending any message first, did you get kicked out of the expedition for wooing too many seniors?" "Not at all. My return was just too hectic to send any messages," he replied with a smile, not going into too much detail at the moment. Then he turned to Quenhild and her two companions and said, "Hi, I'm Lex. I don't believe we've met." "No, we haven't," Quenhild said in the most polite tone she could muster, flashing Lex a smile that could cause anyone to swoon. Honestly, her relationship with her other step-siblings was horrible, so she didn't want to get off on the wrong foot with Lex. "But your reputation roars like thunder among the students, so I wanted to introduce myself to you." Lex raised an eyebrow out of curiosity. His reputation? He hardly knew anyone here. What reputation was there to talk about? Still, he was curious about her, so he invited them in. "Well, come on inside. I would offer you all something to drink or eat, but I don't really have much at home." Even as he said that, he ordered some snacks to be delivered to his apartment via the dorm's room service application. Amelia had been to his place before, so she knew what condition he lived in, and was not surprised, but Quenhild, well, she hid her feelings well, but internally she was a little surprised. It was a good thing she dismissed her attendants before coming in. It would not do if rumors about Lex started to spread because of her. Even though the famous king did not care much for his children, each and every one of his partners was from an extremely prominent family, or were themselves extremely well off. Someone living in such squalor was unheard of. He almost had no personal belongings at all. Considering the fact that Lex was currently dressed in the academy uniform, she wondered if he even had other clothes. The uniform was expected during classes, but otherwise was not mandatory. "Not at all," said Quenhild, "I came over unannounced as is. How can I expect you to host me under such circumstances?" "I am curious about what you've heard about me," said Lex as he carefully sat down. So far, he hadn't shown any indication of losing control of his strength, despite not having any time to adjust his state after his breakthrough, and he was quite proud of it. "Instead of asking what I've heard about you, I think the question should be, what have I not heard?" she said with a light laugh. The stories were so outrageous, from facing an immortal to shooting at one with a simple weapon, to the tales of your numerous feats at your latest expedition. Even if I took them with a grain of salt, or a whole fistful of it, they were too much. I had to investigate. But the school reports I found were even more bizarre than the stories. I can't believe people are actually talking about me, especially about the expedition that literally just happened. Lex didn't know whether to feel flattered or creeped out. Who were these people talking about him, and how had his story spread? Oh, come now, don't be humble. You weren't the only one who was brought back from the expedition, and everyone who came back was full of praise for you. Actually, I head to the hospital first to meet you, because when I read the report on the returnees, I thought you'd still be in the hospital. Based on the pictures. I'm surprised you're awake, let alone good enough to return home. Amelia was suddenly alarmed at hearing the mention of Lex being hospitalized, but Lex instead was intrigued about what that revealed about Quenhild. He knew that someone would definitely report everything that had happened with him during the expedition, but being able to get access to academy records like that was no simple task. Even among school personnel, one would need relevant authority to read files pertaining to things like this. In a situation where a spirit well was involved, Lex imagined the authority should have been even higher. You've heard a lot about me, but I don't seem to know anything about you, said Lex, shifting the focus of the conversation. He didn't think a simple introduction warranted someone like her looking for him all over. Quenhild smiled, as if anticipating this change, and said, "What's there to say about me? My life is not nearly as interesting as yours. I'm just a simple girl, stuck under a couple of overbearing parents. That's the reason why I wanted to meet with you, in fact. Of all your achievements, dropping your family name might be the greatest of them all." Amelia suddenly became extremely tense, as she too had heard the rumors about Lex's origins. In the time she had known him, he never brought it up, and she never asked him about his past, but it would be a lie to say she never wondered about it. My greatest achievement? Lex repeated, confused. Suddenly, he felt a little offended. There was no shortage of incredibly insane things that he had done since he came to the Crystal Realm. How could claiming he had no last name be a greater achievement? It was ridiculous. Seeing that Lex continued with the facade, Quenhild smiled. Well, isn't it? The rumor is, you dropped your family name because you were dissatisfied with your father. That you wanted to carve out your own legend and create your own legacy, unrelated to the Cornelius name. Lex did not immediately make the connection between the name she mentioned and the king, for he was too bewildered by the story attached to him. Me? Carve out a legend, he said, laughing. I have no interest in legend, wait, did you say Cornelius? As in, the royal family? His ignorance of the implied meaning behind Quenhild's words did not last long, for with his increase in cultivation, his brain worked much faster. That's ridiculous, Lex said, laughing even harder. How can I be connected to the royal family? I'm just a simple man, trying to survive in a chaotic world. I am not trying to create any legends, I'm just trying to live a good life. Besides, how believable is it for a member of the royal family to be randomly roaming around? I'm afraid that's one of the more ridiculous rumors you've probably heard. Why can't the children of the king randomly walk around? She asked with an eyebrow raised. She was careful not to say members of the royal family, for one would need the king's actual recognition before could make that claim. After all, I, Quenhild Haugen Cornelius, am a daughter of the king's, and aren't I here, walking around, right beside you? Both Lex and Amelia were startled by her revelation. Lex, who had been so meticulous so far, lost control of his strength, and ripped the arm off his chair, and in the silence that followed, both by the revelation and Lex's minor display of strength, there was a knock on the door. The food had arrived. Chapter 278 Wild Imagination. Lex and Amelia both were taken aback by Quenhild's surprise, and while Lex's lapse was due to his recent breakthrough, Quenhild saw it in a different light. King Cornelius too had done much for mankind, and was seen as a savior by the masses, but his personality was in no way temperate. He was a ruthless, cold-hearted and yet focused man who lived guided by a very strict code of conduct. Unfortunately, his code of conduct did not include kindness. In fact, he could even be extremely cruel to people who he did not see as useful or productive. His focus on pragmatism bled into every facet of his life, and while this was a huge boon for the nation, it was often a huge burden for those close to him. It was often his wives, concubines or children who suffered the most due to this. She could well imagine the kind of hate Lex probably felt for the man, based on whatever his experiences were, mostly because she herself hated him as well. This small flaw in Lex's otherwise perfect facade convinced her even more that she was correct. "Excuse me," Lex said awkwardly as he put down the broken chair handle and opened the door. He grabbed the food and turned back, but froze again. Was he really about to serve royalty, rice pudding cups? Lex did not doubt for even a moment that Quenhild was lying about her parentage, mostly because how crazy would you have to be to make such a claim? Back on Earth, in his youth he had traveled the world, and he remembered strongly how ardent people who lived in monarchies were about their ruler. This was mostly because, if you dared to insult the monarchy in any way, and word got out, no one would even know how you disappeared. Here, in the crystal realm, he couldn't imagine things were much different. Yet Lex's feeling of awkwardness did not last long. He lacked a fundamental reverence many people felt towards the strong or in high positions, mostly because he was so used to being around so many strong people. For example, just based on the fluctuations he could vaguely feel, he knew that Ragnar, the Jotun general, was stronger than anyone he had seen or met in the crystal realm so far. Likewise, the celestial bodyguard he had for a while was even stronger than Ragnar. And then, he had met multiple people even stronger than his bodyguard. This was exactly why, even though he was still vulnerable if strong cultivators used their coercion to physically restrain him, whatever that was, mentally, they could not intimidate him. "I'm sorry to disappoint you, Your Highness," Lex said, unsure of how he was supposed to address royalty here, "but that rumor really is just a rumor. I don't have a surname because I don't have any family in the crystal realm. But, even if I did, for example, have any relation to the royal family, from what I understand, they wouldn't really care if I removed their name or not as long as I don't directly insult them while doing it. After all, isn't the king's motto, 'I don't give a shit'? If he doesn't care, why should anyone else?" He laid out the pudding cups on the table, along with some fruit. He froze again for a moment, recalling that he had no cutlery, nor any plates to offer his guests. He really should stock his apartment a little more, but he was so used to not spending any time at home that it never occurred to him. Amelia and Quenhild, on the other hand, looked at Lex, who was laying the table, his back turned to them, and felt numerous emotions well up in their hearts when he paused. The way he said he had no family in the crystal realm seemed too sincere, and clearly this line of questioning had brought back dark memories. That, alongside his statement of the king's motto, told the story of a neglected son, severing ties after a painful loss. They filled in numerous blanks, and made up weird scenarios in their head that would explain his lacking cultivation, and why he would be in Gristle in the middle of his invasion. Somehow, in the midst of imagining completely different scenarios, the two girls' thoughts coincided as they visualized Lex standing in the rain, alone in front of a grave with the marching hordes of the Craven, slowly gaining land. The filial son stayed until the last moment, and as he turned his back on the grave for the last time, so too did he turn his back on the father that had failed him. Lex, meanwhile, was chiding himself for being a bad host. His reputation as the innkeeper would be tarnished if anyone ever found out he didn't even have a napkin to offer alongside his snacks to literal royalty. It's not much, but please, help yourselves," he finally said, perfectly hiding his embarrassment. The girls helped themselves, and since the pudding cups came with their own disposable utensils, it wasn't really an issue. "Well, if you insist it was just a rumor, then I'll believe you. Such topics are more fit for gossiping little children, anyway. Let's talk about something more practical. Have you heard of the realm races?" "Not really, no. Considering your short time at the academy, I assumed you probably hadn't. Every few decades, the academy opens up a bunch of new minor realms altogether and lets the students scout them out. Despite what it sounds like, it's not a tournament, and there are no prizes, but the students can keep anything they find in any of the minor realms. Since it's usually so beneficial, many students treat it like a race, trying to go through as many of the minor realms as possible before the event finishes. But, not everyone has the same objective. I am planning on participating in the race, but with a completely different agenda. If I can subdue an entire minor realm before the race ends, and take complete control of it, the academy will let me keep the minor realm till I graduate. Your excellent performance recently has attracted a lot of attention, and surely a lot of people will approach you to recruit you. I just wanted to be the one to make the first bid." After that, the conversation became transactional in nature, wherein Quenhild explained her plans to Lex briefly, and her offer to recruit him for her team during the races. There was no theoretical upper or lower limit on any team, as long as all the participants were students, but quite sensibly, Quenhild took a quality over quantity approach. At no point at all during the conversation did it feel like this conversation wasn't the primary reason she had approached Lex, and even Amelia began believing. In fact, Quenhild was so well prepared, and the detail Lex received on his offer was so extensive that if his instincts weren't telling him that she was hiding something, he would have believed it. He didn't immediately accept her offer, and told her he would get back to her. Since the races were still some time off, she didn't mind. Once their conversation was done, she excused herself, leaving Lex and a perplexed Amelia behind. "Don't tell me you heard those rumors too," Lex said to her, after Quenhild left. Looking embarrassed, she smiled weakly and said, "Some people did mention it to me, seeing how much time we spent together." Lex laughed at the absurdity of the claim, but didn't address it again, for he genuinely believed no reasonable person would actually believe the rumor. Instead, the two friends started catching up, and Lex honestly told her about the things that happened on the expedition that weren't a secret. She was startled to learn of the seriousness of his injuries and apologized for making fun of him, but Lex didn't mind. What else were friends for if not teasing one another? Eventually, she left and Lex was genuinely surprised that she didn't notice his breakthrough, not that he brought it up either. He spent the rest of the day meditating and cultivating, slowly getting used to his newfound strength and abilities. Tomorrow was going to be exciting, for he would go look for new techniques to use, and more importantly, he would finally start using arrays. He also needed new weapons, so he would have to visit his old boss. He wondered if he should look for another gun, or ranged weapon basically, or go for something more traditional. Lex was completely engrossed in his own thoughts, oblivious to the earth-shattering statement that would rock the gossip columns of the nation. Well, it wasn't as much of a statement as a discovery. Quenhild Haugen had removed the Cornelius name from her student documents at the academy, and when questioned for the reasons, or if she was afraid of any repercussions, she gave a simple reply. I don't give a shit about that name. Chapter 279 Unlimited Access. King Cornelius II was not an idle man. Every minute of every day was filled with purpose, and not the kind where others schedule meetings or appointments, giving you commitments that you had to keep. No, he was a man who planned his day himself, and filled each part of it with a conscious effort to fulfill his goals. Due to this stringent discipline he maintained, he was often called callous or uncaring towards those close to him. The truth, however, was not that he was uncaring specifically towards them, but that he cared too much about his goals. The people he chose to surround himself with knew this well, and so were selective in providing him news unrelated to whatever he asked. Sometimes, however, there were situations that could not be expected and needed his comments. For events like these, Cornelius had allocated a certain time during his regular briefings. Of course, all of this was dictated by the fact that the event did not require urgency. In case of an emergency, his assistants would obviously interrupt him. Today, however, was not such a case, which is why, as he ate breakfast, he received various bits of news. To be clear, he wasn't receiving news while eating breakfast, but that so much time was wasted on these things, he decided to eat to fill the time. Someone like him didn't actually have any need for food. He was an immortal, after all. There is a bit of news about one of your children again, said miscellaneous assistant A. Despite having the same first name, there was no connection in miscellaneous assistant A and miscellaneous friend A. Ah, tell me, another disappointment, or did one of them achieve something worthy of note? The king asked. Assistant A paused, unsure how to respond, directly shared the news. Quenhild, your daughter from the Haugen estate, has dropped your name from her academy identification papers and when asked about the reason, responded with, I don't give a shit about that name. Despite himself, Cornelius chuckled, then paused. He didn't care about the name being dropped or her comment. He was a king by right and power, and had forged his position through blood and carnage. He did not feel his position threatened by such things. No, he paused because the mention of the Haugen estate reminded him of some unpleasant memories. In his life, due to his position and power, there were few who dared accost him, and fewer still of those were humans. Quenhild's mother happened to be one of them, though. She was his only legal wife who he did not actively pursue. Instead, she was the one who approached him and, very bluntly, negotiated the title of wife as well as a child from him. It was not like she was in love with him or anything. She was an extremely capable woman of influence and merely needed the title to progress her own agenda. Of course, she could not threaten him because, honestly, who could? But her influence was genuine, and she could create endless problems for him, and she was not afraid even in the slightest that he would be offended by her bluntness, or think he would harm her. In the end, she outmaneuvered him politically, gained what she wanted, and then left of her own violation. The latest news he had of her, she had expanded her influence to the realm of the Sentinels and actually controlled vast territories there. Next, he said placidly, unconcerned by the news. On the topic of your children, there is another one showing potential, just that, it is actually unconfirmed if he's actually your child. Oh? Cornelius was actually genuinely surprised. Elaborate. Assistant A briefly detailed Lex's various achievements with a degree of accuracy that would have shocked Lex himself had he heard, especially his involvement in the battle between the Trollops. The details of his actions on that front were stated as inconclusive, but he was listed as the primary instigator of the battle. His breakthrough to the Foundation realm was not mentioned, for that had only just happened, but a medical report stating that his body seemed ready to undergo the breakthrough at any time was attached as well. The issue arose when he was being treated for his wounds. Having heard the rumor as well, Vernan, the local instructor, ordered his bloodline tested to see if he was related to you. The tests were inconclusive. There's something in his blood that prevents it from being traced to any relative, and he showed signs of a lineage bloodline, but that too has been hidden somehow. He, or at least someone, has taken great care to ensure the boy cannot be connected to his family in any way. Inconsequential, Cornelius answered, having lost interest in Lex's origin. Whether Lex was his son or not, why did it matter? But I like his focus and initiative. Update his file. So long as his purpose is to improve himself, help him however the Academy can. Reassess him in 6 months, and if he maintains such discipline, notify me again. Of everything he heard, he really liked the way Lex spent all his time either working, studying or improving himself in one way or another. Kind of focus he appreciated, and wouldn't mind helping to nurture. While we're on the topic of your children, 12 of them have tried to break through to the Earth Immortal realm since I last updated you. 11 of them failed, and their funerals were organized. The one that succeeded. The reports continued for only a short while longer, for the king had too many other things to do. Lex hummed the tune to I Feel Good as he walked into the Academy library, a ridiculous grin painting his handsome face. Despite its size, the Academy had only one library that had been built directly into a mountain range. There was only limited alteration to the natural appearance of the mountain Lex was currently on, mostly to mark the entrance to the library. How far the library itself ran, and how many mountains it filled, perhaps only a few handful of people knew. None of that mattered to Lex, for early in the morning he received a notification on his PT, and it was one that surprised him, as well as filled him with enormous glee. Due to the size of his contribution during the expedition, he was provided free access to a limited portion of the library, which included the spirit techniques section. The free access would only last for 6 months, but that was more than enough time for Lex. Oh yes, Lex felt good because he was about to have a free hand at whatever technique he wanted for the Foundation realm. SSN, OV, Elbin. Good morning, Lex said in the warmest way he knew how to one of the librarians as he passed his student identification. I'd like to look at the list of Foundation realm techniques, please. That's a big list. Do you have anything specific you want? I'm good for now, thanks, replied Lex, flashing a generous smile. The librarian shrugged and led Lex to a private room, and helped him log onto the library's terminal. After that, he opened up the entire list of techniques they had available, and showed Lex how to narrow the search if he needed to. After thanking the librarian, Lex looked at the list. A list of 130 million techniques was before him. The size of the list did not overwhelm him, but instead made him sad. He would have loved to see how helpful the fancy monocle could have been if it had access to this library. But, it was best not to dwell too much on these things. He went through the list randomly for a bit, to get an idea for the kinds of techniques they had. But Lex was not here without any focus. He remembered the Midnight Games well, and recalled the performance of the best few Foundation Realm players. Alexander Morrison and Kara Deathsworn were 2 of the best performers, and he thought back well to their fighting styles. He thought back to all the kinds of techniques they deployed, and how they used them. He had a few days before his classes began, and he was in no rush, so it was best to take his time and choose well. He thought back to the battle with the Druk that he saw. Despite being an almost indestructible beast, it was captured and incapacitated due to cleverly using its own sturdiness against it. Lex had excellent defense, but that would be pointless if he ever got in a situation where he was captured. Then, it would only be a matter of time before his enemies defeated him. So, his first order of business was to investigate mobility and/or escape techniques. He narrowed down the list in front of him and began searching. Origin realm, unnamed region of space. An escape ship crash-landed on a planet deep in the wilderness. The pilot, a simple merchant, ran out of the ship, covered in blood, and escaped in a random direction. Mere minutes later, a small but vicious-looking spaceship landed near the escape vessel, and its inhabitants investigated the escape ship. Among the various belongings the merchant had been too panicked to bring along with him was a golden key. Along with everything else of value, the key was brought back onto the spaceship, to be brought before the captain. Chapter 280 Midnight Madness. Nzar, the captain of the small ship, was a Quash. Quash were an extremely violent species and lived as nomads throughout the universe. They were not too significant on a large scale because of their severely lacking population, since they never settled anywhere, and they didn't really focus on developing their civilization. Despite these extremely negative aspects, they could be considered a common sight in many interstellar metropolises due to the simple fact that they were a very talented species. They had a higher growth rate in the lower cultivation levels than many other species, humans included, and were more often than not winners in most fights. And, for the fights that they lost, a lot of the time they managed to escape. With 6 sturdy legs spread across its long, muscular body, 4 sets of claws, 2 on either side of its long body, and the ability to move its internal organs as it wanted, a quash was a menace in a fight. Naturally, they had their own weapons designed to suit their bodies that were very different from swords and guns, and since they were not commonly seen, they were all the more dangerous. N'Zar operated as a sort of space pirate, but not exactly. In the Origin realm, pirates were obviously a menace and extremely notorious for their danger, but they weren't inherently evil. Many of them were driven by circumstances of their own, and their target was more towards getting rich and then secretly retiring than anything else. Rather than a pirate, N'Zar qualified as a pillager. He and his crew actively looked for undefended or weak prey and attacked just as much for resources as for the thrill of the hunt. They would take what was useful to them, and burn the rest, something a pirate would never do, or they would take along even what wasn't useful in an effort to sell it. He was in the middle of a hunt when his crew, a mix of various species, from slimes to beasts and more, brought him a golden key. As a species that did not have eyes, Quash had other senses to compensate, which is why he became aware of the key long before it was actually brought to him. Unlike the humans of Earth, who only felt vague sensations of what the key could offer to them, N'Zar immediately picked up on the purpose of the key: it would teleport him to a special minor realm. Interested, he gathered his crew to explore this new arena. At the Midnight Inn, Gerard was currently on his regular patrols in his reliable old golf cart. The video game tournament was going well, as the semi-finals were taking place, and the inn was more lively than it had been in a while. New novel chapters are published on Novelbin. Old Man Will and Hera were going to finalize a trade agreement today with the governor of Vegas Minima worth billions of dollars, and so were present with a large entourage. Jimmy and Layla were, as usual, conducting a raid towards the heinous and malevolent peacocks of the inn. Queen Sophia of New York was celebrating with her son, Raphael, for not only was he walking once again, he had miraculously learned about the location of an incredible panacea on Earth that would heal him and allow him to cultivate once more. King Marlowe was currently busy retrieving that medicine himself, as it was too important to leave to someone else. The Morrison family was also gathered at the inn in its entirety, for Alexander had come to the inn after many months. His journey in joining the Jotun army had been anything but smooth, but his horizons had expanded rapidly. He was currently having a meeting with his family, discussing the future direction of the family. Blaine, Chen, Lily and Iris also happened to be at the inn, discussing old times. Considering the fact that Blaine and Lily had left on a spaceship, the only time they got to interact with their friends was at the inn. Many of the original nascents from Earth were here as well, drinking to forget their problems. It had been long enough for the inn to be connected to Earth, not to mention the new minor realm that never closed, that the number of nascent cultivators on Earth had exploded. Of course, these new nascent cultivators could not compare to the old ones, but suffice to say, the original 5 families had long since lost much of the power they held. Just the Morrison family had 4 nascent cultivators, in fact, and Marlowe was obscenely strong for incomprehensible reasons, making it so he was currently the strongest individual on Earth, at least on the surface. At this particular time, there were even a few devils at the inn. They had claimed that they would visit the inn regularly to recruit Earthlings, and this was their first ever visit. Pramod and Harriet Shelby Ruby Selma Jane happened to be visiting as well. Suffice to say, through a random coincidence, the inn was currently hosting almost all of its most regular or renowned guests. As it so happened, it was at this time that N'Zar and his small crew of 100 aliens entered the inn. As soon as N'Zar entered the inn, he got a sense for the size and spiritual concentration of the inn, and immediately decided to seize the inn. Without wasting any time, he ordered his subordinates to begin scouting the inn for all its dangers. Such insidious intent was obviously picked up by the security room. Chad, the deputy head of security, was currently in the room, and as soon as he got the notification, he activated the formation around the entrance of the inn, trapping the pillagers there. Calmly, he notified Gerard of the situation while also reporting to Mary. Mary then reported to Lex, who was currently reviewing spiritual techniques. As soon as he scanned the inn, and understood the situation not only of the invaders but of his guests as well, he smiled. He had been waiting for the next time the inn was invaded, and the situation of the invasion couldn't be better even if he planned it himself. He passed along some instructions to Mary, stunning her, before he turned his attention to the event management panel. A small 100,000 MP later, his plan was set in motion. Just to be sure no problems occurred, Lex used his advanced authority to disable the invaders' ability to return from the inn. Since they had come here with ill intentions, there was no reason to leave. Across the inn, the sound of a gong was heard, followed by the voice of the assistant innkeeper. Dear guests, the Midnight Inn is having a spontaneous, special event for your entertainment. A small horde of invaders have entered the inn, but, under the direction of the innkeeper, instead of being eliminated, they have been placed in a trapping formation. Since there are 101 invaders, 101 participants may enter the special event and take place. The participants will enter the formation and fight the invaders. Killing an enemy gives you 1 point, but capturing an enemy gets you 2 points. At the end of the event, the participant with the most points gets an award of 50,000 MP. Betting and special commemorative items for the event will be available. The event will begin in 30 minutes. As soon as the announcements ended, projected screens showing the invaders' army appeared in front of all guests. All spots for the event were filled within the first second, as numerous guests were attracted by the prize, while the others just wanted to join in the fun. When the list of participants was concluded, the betting pool over the winner began and immediately excitement filled the air. Many guests left the inn to call their friends to join in the festivities. Once they returned, since the primary teleportation point was locked, they were teleported to a secondary point surrounded by various guards to ensure no one with evil intentions could enter. After ensuring they were normal guests, they were allowed to go as they pleased. Raphael watched the screen curiously. This event was titled Midnight Madness, and he had no recollection of anything like that from his previous life. But then again, since he lacked all interaction with the inn, it was not a surprise. He ordered a Saturn cake in anticipation for the event, and placed a few bets himself, though they were mostly small. By now, Nzar had noticed that he was trapped in a formation and was trying to figure out a way to bypass it. Little did he know, all his actions were being watched by thousands of people. In a few minutes, as it so happened, the merchant that he had been chasing finally remembered the specialness of the golden keys. He had never tried it before, but he was desperate enough to try anything, since he was too wounded to properly hide his tracks. When he arrived at the inn, and then learned about what was happening, he burst out into a melodious laughter, before eventually fainting due to blood loss. Though, before fainting, he took advantage of a special feature of the event. Placed a special, individually financed bounty on Nzar that could only be claimed if the person who killed Nzar sent the unaware quash the merchant's regards right before killing him. That was bound to haunt him even into the afterlife.